Crazy mistakes that changed history forever. The Titanic dismissing iceberg warnings. In the evening hours of April 14th, 1912, the Titanic was just reaching the midpoint on its voyage to New York City. And as we all know, the Titanic never made it. All of this is relatively common knowledge. But what's not commonly known is the fact that these icebergs were not out of nowhere. The Titanic's crew specifically received warnings from other ships in the area about a potentially dangerous iceberg field, and the Titanic not only received but acknowledged these warnings. However, the tragedy still happened. And the reason why is likely one of the biggest mistakes ever in maritime history. Now, let's zoom in on exactly what led up to this fateful event and the mistakes that unfortunately caused it. One thing that's important to note is that the Titanic was not alone on its voyage. It wasn't necessarily surrounded by ships, but in a roughly 250-mile radius, there was 9 other ships making the same voyage across the North Atlantic, heading in both directions, both east and west, in what is known as shipping lanes, basically imaginary roads in the water. Some of the ships that were slightly further ahead than the Titanic all made comments about a large ice field that was directly in the path of these ships, meaning that action was required to actively avoid this ice field. These communications between ships were known as the Marconi messages, and these messages gave explicit information about where these icebergs were, how large they were, and how dangerous they could potentially be to a ship. In the captain's own journal that was kept in the black box on the ship, he even wrote down that he had been seeing extremely large icebergs and that the conditions outside were ideal for ice formations. Although with all of these notes being made, he had one note that he underlined in his journal that stated, quote, "no reduction of speed," meaning that even though the captain was fully aware of all of the dangerous icebergs and potential more to come, he didn't seem very concerned about them. And what's even more interesting is the plethora of theories on why the captain never slowed down, which is an obvious question that most would ask. If you know that you're heading towards a dangerous area in the water, why would you maintain such a high speed? And one of the most popular theories is that the person running the White Star Company, the company that owned the Titanic and other ships, intentionally withheld information from the captain to ensure that he didn't slow down speeds so that the Titanic would make it to New York on time, maintaining the company's reputation. However, I'm sure you can already see the irony. Regardless, at 11:39 p.m., the captain goes to bed and leaves his senior officers in place. And only shortly after that, one of the lookouts in the crow's nest spots a giant iceberg directly ahead. And by the time it's spotted, it's already almost too late. The ship is moving too fast, and while the ship did in its last moments slightly steer out of the way of the iceberg, this turn could have actually made things worse. Because now, the ship wasn't heading directly into the iceberg was going to be scraping along the side of the Titanic, essentially ripping it apart. Over 1,500 people lost their lives, and the Titanic became a legend of tragedy. This isn't to say that if the Titanic had reduced its speed, it would have guaranteed not to sink. Although many experts believe that maintaining a high speed with such dangerous conditions approaching was definitely an oversight and a fatal mistake that likely caused the Titanic to sink. The dropped helmet downfall. In 547 BC, there was a city known as Sardis. And during this time, the city of Sardis was under the rule of Croesus, the king of Lydia. The kingdom of Lydia, for context, would be in modern-day Turkey. Now, what's interesting about Sardis is that this city is extremely well fortified, both geographically and architecturally. And what I mean by this is that Sardis wasn't only just a city with huge castle walls, it also was built on top of very steep mountains, meaning that this was one place that you would not want to try to siege simply because of how unoptimal this place would be to attack. Croesus would have such an advantage when it comes to high ground invisibility and knowledge of how to navigate the landscape. Anybody who would try to attack and siege the city would essentially have a death wish. That was until Cyrus the Great entered the chat. Cyrus the Great heard that Croesus was actually busy doing some other battles that he wasn't doing too well in, and because Croesus wasn't doing so well, he disbanded his troops and was basically taking the winter off to try to refight in the next spring. But when Cyrus the Great got word that Croesus was disbanding his troops, he figured now would be the perfect time to try to siege this impossible city. And that's what happened. Cyrus and his troops showed up on the ground outside of Sardis, and Croesus, kind of shocked that they were even there, quickly gathered all of the troops that were within the castle walls, and a battle ensued. Interestingly, Cyrus actually won this initial battle outside of the castle walls. However, Sardis was still not sieged and was still believed to be unsiegeable. And Croesus himself was still confident they would never get inside the city walls, and this confidence wasn't unfounded. There was literally ancient prophecies stating that this well-fortified city could never be captured. That was until one tiny mistake was made. One motivated soldier in Cyrus's army was taking a walk around the mountain when he found himself near the back of this massive mountain, simply looking up and watching the city, when he noticed one of the Lydian guards at the top of the hill. The Lydian guard didn't notice the soldier, so the soldier just watched him to see if there was anything he could learn. And what happened definitely changed history. The Lydian soldier, not paying attention, accidentally dropped his helmet down the hill. And because he didn't know that he was being watched, he went ahead and retrieved his helmet. But as he retrieved his helmet, he inadvertently exposed the only vulnerable position of of the entire city. And after this Persian soldier watched this Lydian soldier go from the city of Sardis down to gather his helmet and then back up almost effortlessly, he knew he had some crazy intel. And later that night, that same Persian soldier went back to the same location, tried to retrace the steps of that Lydian soldier that he saw, which he was able to do successfully. He shared this information with his army, and the rest is history. With their golden ticket into Sardis, Cyrus and his men laid siege to Sardis for 14 days, eventually capturing it. And it was with this siege that the Persian Empire grew stronger. And I guess it goes to show, no matter how fortified you think you are, never expose your back door. Hitler sleeping in on D-Day. June 6, 1944 signifies a massive win for the Allied powers in World War II. American, Canadian, and British forces were able to storm the beaches of Nazi-occupied Normandy in France, giving them the leverage to truly sink their teeth into the Axis powers, allowing them to ultimately win the war. And while we're all grateful that things worked out this way, why did it work out this way? At the time, there was a very real and dystopian possibility that the Nazis could have won D-Day and history would have looked a lot different. But that's a bit off topic. The biggest contributors to the Allied powers' success on D-Day comes down to two major points. One being the Allied powers' general clever strategy, and the second being a general lack of planning and communication in preparation for this attack. And when I say in preparation, I mean the Germans knew that the coast of France was susceptible to an attack, and they were at this point expecting it. But the only problem was that they didn't know where the Allied forces would attack, and this was a major problem internally. Hitler and other high-ranking officials believed that Pas de Calais is undoubtedly where the Allied powers would try to land. However, other officials believed that Normandy was also a possibility. There was no general consensus on where they could have landed, and Hitler's solution was to spread out troops all across France's shoreline. And while this seems logical, it had a major flaw. No one individual location was extremely well equipped, and when the invasion did happen, it would take some time for a counterattack from the Germans to gather all of the other troops from the shoreline to the one area where the actual battle was happening. This mismanagement alone could be considered its own historical mistake, but it doesn't end there. Due to some previous red herrings that the Allied powers threw, specifically staging a false invasion on Pas de Calais, when the actual attack on D-Day happened, German troops weren't sure if this was a real invasion or simply another distraction, which leads us to the situation I mentioned earlier. On the morning of D-Day, when the attacks started happening, Hitler was fast asleep. It's reported that he was up late the night before watching newsreels and fell asleep around 3 a.m. Now, interestingly, because the high-ranking officials did not believe that the attack on Normandy was not the major attack that they saw coming, they decided that it was not worth waking up Hitler, and they decided they would allow him to wake up and then they would figure out what to do next. However, that window from the storming of Normandy to when Hitler woke up and began to make counterattack plans, significant progress was already made by the Allied powers, leaving Germany in a really bad spot. Now, this doesn't mean that the Allied powers had no resistance. The Allied powers had to fight against extreme resistance and saw countless tragedies during this battle, with one of the biggest reasons being the Germans fought like hell because it was very well known among the high-ranking Nazi officials that if the Allied powers were able to successfully storm the beaches, they would have at that point won the war. So even though the Germans were unprepared for this battle, they still fought as hard as they could because they knew that this battle would likely be one of the last, which wasn't far from the truth. Hitler spread his troops way too thin, tried to keep too tight of a grip on the entire operation. His high-ranking officials didn't take the attack on Normandy seriously and didn't wake him up, and for that reason, Hitler slept in until 10 a.m., 3.5 hours after the massive naval and aerial bombardment started to take place on French soil. And I think it's important to note that while this was a mistake on Hitler's part, this mistake gave the Allied powers a lot of leverage, and the impact this had on history was net positive, so sometimes mistakes can be good, if they're made by bad people. This video in total could have been 10 hours long with all of the insane historical mistakes, and while I can't make a 10-hour long video, I can make this video, and if you guys really like this video, I can make a part 2. So if you guys are interested in seeing even more, please let me know in the comments below by either commenting part 2 or even just leaving a like. Your guys' support always means a lot, and if you're new here, feel free to subscribe. We post every Friday. Let's move on. The Trojan horse. Right off the bat, I'm gonna say there's definitely a lot of skepticism surrounding the entire Trojan War situation. At this point, archaeologists and historians are pretty certain that the Trojan Wars, happened, although there is a lot of legend and myth surrounding the entire situation, specifically demigods and divine intervention and things like that. Another very popular possible myth is the Trojan horse situation. And while it's not exactly proven to be true, it also hasn't been proven to be false either. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to tell the story as there is real historical roots, and the story is still rather compelling and interesting. So as the story goes, during the Trojan Wars, the Greeks came up with a very interesting method of attacking the city of Troy from the inside. That method involved a large wooden horse. Now, some versions of the story claim that the Greeks actually gifted the horse to the Trojans as a peace offering, saying, hey, we don't want any problems, here you go, you can have this horse. But another version of the story that I think is more plausible, assuming the situation is real, is the fact that the Greeks were extremely deceptive with how they delivered this horse. Some versions of the story claim that the Greeks intentionally left the horse near the city of Troy and made it seem like they spent so much time on it, but then at the last minute abandoned it for mysterious reasons. Information was given to the Trojan authorities saying that the Greeks were building this horse as an offering to the god Athena. And because the Trojans didn't want the Greeks to have any sort of divine superiority, they decided they would steal the horse and offer it to Athena themselves, then getting the preference from the gods. Both stories are right out there, but I do believe that them stealing it for their own gain is a lot more likely than them accepting a massive questionable gift from their enemy at the time. Regardless, once this wooden horse was within Trojan walls, the hidden Greek soldiers inside waited until nightfall, slowly and quietly exited the horse and began killing the guards. They then opened the gates into Troy and allowed all hell to break loose. And while I'm keeping this one a bit short simply because there is very murky facts associated with it, the city of Troy did exist, it did fall, and the Trojan Wars were a thing, the exact details on the ongoings are interesting. And while the story of the Trojan horse is more or less at this point considered legend with possible historical roots, it's definitely not confirmed. And while it's hard to say that that situation that maybe didn't happen changed history forever, I still think it was worth mentioning. Because whether the situation happened or not, we still learned a valuable lesson from this legend. The Bay of Pigs time zone confusion. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a failed military operation by the USA on Cuba during a time when Fidel Castro was gaining a lot of power within Cuba and getting really friendly with the Soviet Union, and America did not like it whatsoever. The US president at the time, John F. Kennedy, decided that his best course of action was to secretly try to overthrow Fidel Castro, but in a way that left him some plausible deniability. And that alone is kind of a mistake on his part, because him being half in, half out definitely was a major contributing factor in the Bay of Pigs invasion failing, but it's not what I want to focus on this point, because I think there's an even smaller and even more hilarious mistake that took place during this already failed operation. There's a lot of nuance to the situation, but for a bit of additional context, when John F. Kennedy was running for president, he was running on a very anti-communist sentiment. And after he got into power, when there was a neighbor south of the American border who was very communist, he had to do something about it. But there was an issue. Cuba was getting close with the Soviet Union, and this was during the Cold War, so Kennedy did not want to rub the Soviet Union the wrong way. But at the same time, if Kennedy did nothing about Cuba just becoming this communist society, he was going to look passive to the people that voted for him to help eliminate communism, which is why he decided to be a bit sneaky. And by sneaky, I mean he literally assembled an army specifically of Cuban refugees in America. And he even went as far as painting an American B-26 bomber to look like it was Cuban, so that when it was bombing Cuba, it wouldn't look like America was involved whatsoever. Although the bomber was almost instantly known to be American as soon as it was seen flying over Cuba, which is kind of what exposed the entire situation, but we'll get into that. The ultimate goal from the American perspective was to simply invade the Bay of Pigs, build a small base in that area, and through the successful landing of troops in the Bay of Pigs, through the power of that army and through the power of locals now feeling emboldened to rise up against this communist government, they would easily be able to overthrow the government, kill Castro, and have a new capitalistic society installed in Cuba once again. But there was a few problems. One, the American forces, more specifically Cuban refugees fighting on America's behalf, did not have proper support for reasons we'll get into. And also, the government actually underestimated how popular Fidel Castro actually was. The invasion started with a bombing raid from American planes on Cuban soil, and then the following day, troops were on the ground in the Bay of Pigs. However, at this time, the plan was relatively exposed due to that plane being poorly disguised and seen early. And because John F. Kennedy didn't want to catch the blame for having this entire invasion, he almost instantly withdrew all air support that was deemed crucial to the mission, basically leaving the troops that he had just sent there to die. He withdrew the support to have plausible deniability that, oh, I didn't want that going on, but in reality, that's exactly what he wanted. And all he did was just ensure the failure of that invasion. And due to the lack of support, the invasion only lasted 3 days, and the Cuban forces from America were either killed or surrendered. Now, this is where time zones actually come into play, because during this situation, as a last-ditch effort, a bombing plane was actually sent from Nicaragua to help provide support. However, Nicaragua is in a different time zone than Cuba, but the bomber jet pilots did not take this into consideration. So when there was plans for the bomber jet pilot to be accompanied by fighter jets over Cuba, there was an hour difference between their plans, meaning in this last-ditch effort, this bomber plane was unescorted by fighter jets, leaving it extremely vulnerable, cutting that plan short too when the time actually came. And this sort of last-ditch effort failure was the nail in the coffin. And the backlash because of this failed Bay of Pigs invasion was the following. One, Fidel Castro only grew stronger as a leader because in the eyes of the Cuban citizens, he had just defended the country from an attack from the American government, the biggest military machine in the world, making him look like an extremely strong and powerful leader. And besides making the citizens favor Fidel even more, this made Fidel favor the Soviet Union even more, which is why this situation was basically the catalyst for the Cuban Missile Crisis, which only happened a year later. So yeah, although there was military fighter pilots that were not able to remember time zones between Nicaragua and Cuba, leaving a bomber plane completely vulnerable, that's more or less of an oversight in this entire operation that was ultimately a huge failure for the American government. And this definitely had very serious historical repercussions. NASA ignoring Challenger warnings. In 1986, the space shuttle known as Challenger was set for an amazing mission. The shuttle had 7 bright astronauts on board, and this crew was ready for takeoff. And on 11:39 a.m., just off the coast of Florida, the Challenger spaceship took off. Things looked relatively normal until just over a minute after the launch took place, the situation turned catastrophic. The space shuttle broke apart and disintegrated 14 kilometers in the air, leaving all 7 of the astronauts dead. This failed launch was a national tragedy. However, it could have been easily prevented. You see, after this devastating launch, a huge investigation was underway, and what they eventually ended up finding was that the cause of this entire explosion was the shuttle's rubber O-rings, which may seem like a non-crucial component, but in this case, these components were extremely crucial because they actually sealed the rocket boosters. And if you don't have sealed boosters, then hot gases can escape, and having hot gases right next to massive fuel tanks is a recipe for disaster. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. Now, obviously, hindsight is always 20/20, and if they had that information previously, they could have prevented it, but they did have this information. Months before the launch, one of the engineers on the project, Roger Boyce-Jolly, along with other engineers, both repeatedly warned NASA that the O-rings on the boosters may not function properly in low temperatures. But these weren't just verbal warnings. Boyce-Jolly even submitted a formal, detailed memo emphasizing the serious concerns and the potential deadly consequences. And even though numerous engineers warned about a potential fatal flaw with this launch, NASA ignored all of the warnings. Obviously, the mistake in question. But it doesn't end there, because once it was clear that NASA was not taking these concerns seriously, a group of individuals formed, making it their mission to stop this launch for the safety of the astronauts, although they didn't have the authority or support to actually prevent the launch from happening. And despite NASA being aware of the potential flaw, the launch still took place, and the world lost 7 astronauts, and NASA lost a lot of trust. One of the most devastating parts of this entire situation is that NASA knew that the specific failure of this O-ring would only be triggered by a cold environment. And even with this information, they decided to launch the rocket in January, which in Florida isn't typically that cold, but this day that it launched was particularly cold, and even still, with both of these factors, they still continued to launch on that day. When doing research for this section, I actually watched a video by Free Documentary on YouTube that has a full 50-minute breakdown on why this entire situation happened. And while I totally recommend going and watching that, and I'll even link that in the description, I wanted to quickly highlight the comments, because there was a lot of people commenting on this video that had personal experiences that were honestly heartbreaking. One of which comes from Leslie, where she states that her father was actually one of the engineers who tried to stop the launch. However, because him and other engineers weren't able to prevent the launch, when the eventual launch ended up happening and taking the lives of 7 astronauts, her father, as well as other engineers, became severely depressed simply because that they felt they had failed the astronauts and even had a hand in killing the astronauts because they were unable to prevent the launch, which is truly terrible. Obviously, they were not responsible for the deaths whatsoever and actively tried to prevent them. However, NASA was unwilling to take their advice. The Chernobyl disaster. The story of Chernobyl is one that we are all likely familiar with at this point in time, but it cannot be understated how much of an impact this tragedy had not only on innocent civilians, but also on the outlook on nuclear power for decades to come. Ironically, the Chernobyl disaster took place once again in 1986. Not a good year for global tragedies. And while this situation was different, it did have some overlap, specifically with the fact that this disaster too could have been easily avoided with simple safety regulations. The Chernobyl power plant was one of the most advanced in the entire country. Specifically, Reactor 4, the reactor that exploded, was the newest, only being made 3 years before the disaster. On the day of the tragedy, a safety test was supposed to be carried out by the day crew during their shift. However, they did not carry out the safety test during the day, so the night crew had to take over. This doesn't seem like a big deal until you understand that the night crew was not nearly as trained as the day crew, and they were not supposed to be doing safety tests. However, in this case, they did. They had minimal time to actually prepare for how this was going to happen, or how to properly deal with any sort of adversity in case something went wrong. And on top of their poor training and lack of experience, the Soviet Union was also very secretive about this technology in general. So even the people that were experienced in the situation were not fully in the loop with how everything was even operating to begin with. However, the night crew went about doing the safety test, and this safety test is exactly what resulted in the explosion of Reactor 4. Now, this isn't to say that this was the only issue that took place within Chernobyl, because at this point it is well known that Chernobyl had serious design flaws that were essentially destined to fail. And similar to the situation we just talked about, there was people working within the Chernobyl power plant that had reservations about the entire system that they were even using. Although, once again, their warnings were ignored. One of the biggest design flaws was that Chernobyl actually had a positive feedback loop when things were not going good. In most other nuclear power plants, if things were to get out of control, there would be a negative feedback loop, meaning that even without any human intervention, if the power plant was out of control, the reactor would by default cool down, produce less energy, and eventually fizzle out. However, with Chernobyl, things were designed with a positive feedback loop, meaning that if things got out of control, the generators would only get hotter and hotter, creating more and more power, which would only then get hotter and create more power until the eventual explosion. On the day of the actual explosion, only 2 people died. Although in the 2 weeks following the explosion, 28 firefighters who were working on putting out the actual fire that took place in combination with the exploded reactor died due to radiation sickness. That's over 10% of the firefighters that helped put out the initial fire. Immediately after the explosion, 115,000 people were evacuated from a 30-kilometer radius, and 8 tons of radiation were shot into the atmosphere, which eventually made its way over almost all of Europe. And after everything was said and done, the toxicity of the radioactive cloud that came out of this explosion was equivalent to 400 Hiroshima atomic bomb explosions. Not in terms of actual explosive disaster, but specifically in terms of radioactivity. As of right now, this entire situation cost over $700 billion US, and today the cleanup is still going on, and the total cleanup for the Chernobyl situation is expected to be completed in 2065, almost 80 years after the initial explosion. The accidental discovery of penicillin. Yep, you've heard me right. This video has been relatively dark, so I figured for the last entry on this list, I'd leave it on a positive note. In 1928, Scottish physician Alexander Fleming was studying a specific bacterial culture, and during this study, he decided that he would leave his culture plate out on his workbench over the weekend. That's not so odd, but what was odd was the fact that when he came back on Monday morning to check on this bacteria culture he had left out, he had noticed that there was mold growing on the plate. Now, initially, having mold growing on your bacteria culture means that the sample is just worthless and you have to start again. But he noticed something interesting. The bacteria that was surrounding this mold was destroyed and didn't exist anymore. And this gave him an interesting idea. He began to continue tests to see how powerful this mold could be when it comes to neutralizing and destroying bacteria. And it was this observation that eventually led to penicillin, the world's true first antibiotic, which at this point has saved millions upon millions of lives. The mold is known as Penicillium notatum, and that little bit of mold just magically appearing on Fleming's culture plate undoubtedly had a massive impact on history forever. And just goes to show, sometimes something you perceive as negative actually ends up being the best thing that could possibly happen to you. And just imagine what could have happened if Alexander wasn't feeling so inquisitive this day and just decided to angrily throw out this culture plate because it wasn't to his liking and had mold on it. History is truly wild. The most diabolical human experiments ever performed. The child and the ape experiment. Have you ever seen those cute videos of, new families, a young couple and they have a baby and they have a puppy and the puppy and the baby are playing together? Yeah, the ape and the child experiment is basically the worst possible version of that. This experiment takes place in 1931. It was conducted by a young couple, Winthrop and Luella Kellogg, and they recently just had a baby boy named Donald. And when Donald turned 10 months old, he had another sibling, not a brother, but a sister. However, this sister was not biological or even related by species. This sister that he was given was a 7-month-old chimpanzee named Gua. Winthrop Kellogg was a psychologist who specifically worked on the psychology of animals, primarily dolphins, rats, and birds. And him and his wife decided that it would be best to take their work home and to up the ante by not only experimenting with a chimpanzee, but also by effect their own child. The couple planned on documenting this entire experiment that they were about to begin. And the specific point of this experiment was to study the environmental influence upon early behavior, which what that really meant was they wanted to see if they raised a baby and an ape the exact same way at the exact same time, if they could get a similar outcome. And you can probably already see where this is going. It's speculated that they initially thought that this experiment would be relatively harmless and that their child would simply be a baseline to refer to when it comes to early education. And only the chimpanzee would be tested on because only the chimpanzee was being treated differently, right? The child hanging out with a chimpanzee wasn't going to be affected by this. Well, I won't spoil it, but it wasn't fully accurate. Interestingly, the Kellogg's thought they were doing the moral thing because initially they actually wanted to test the opposite. They wanted to see what the effects of having a child grow up in the wild would be. But because it's extremely dangerous and unethical to leave a baby in the woods, they're like, oh, well, why don't we just take an animal and put it in a human condition to see exactly how smart a chimpanzee can be and what their true natural potential would be if they were raised as a human. When you put it in that perspective, it may almost kind of seem logical, right? Regardless, after Donald and Gua were introduced, the tests began. And over the next 9 months, there was full-time grueling tests taking place between Gua and Donald to see exactly how a baby chimp and a baby human would compare and develop as they were both being treated the exact same as a normal baby would. Although, was Donald really being treated like a normal baby? They likely never had the time to ask that question because over these 9 months, there were so many experiments, tests, practices. There was literally no time to think about anything besides the daily tasks. Winthrop, during this time, time literally took a leave of absence from his job to focus on this experiment full time, and even moved his family down to Florida to be closer to the university where he had gotten this chimp and where he would be submitting his research. Now, after 9 months of daily testing and analysis, the experiment was mysteriously stopped. And while almost every aspect of this experiment was relatively well documented, the reason for why it stopped was not, which led to a bit of speculation. One primary belief is that they ended the experiment due to the rapid growth of Gua compared to Donald. Obviously, animals develop a lot faster than humans do, and in 9 months, Gua could have doubled or tripled in size, making her possibly dangerous to baby Donald. However, another leading theory is due to the fact that Donald was picking up more chimpanzee tendencies than the Kellogg's would have liked. And this is supported by some of the documents that the Kellogg's made. They even admitted near the end of the test that Donald was behind when it came to communication, and really only had a very small vocabulary of words and wasn't babbling much, and typically would only mimic the noises that Gua would make. Regardless of the reason, after 9 months, the experiment was closed. And while the experiment was well documented and completed at this point, the story doesn't end there. Because unfortunately, only a year after Gua was returned to the facility that she was taken from, she passed away from pneumonia. And Donald, on the other hand, was reported to have suffered from social and emotional issues through his young and adult life, and even ended up taking his own life at the age of 43. At this point, with the experiment basically being almost 100 years old, it's kind of up to speculation to try to understand if the parents knew that Donald would simply be a control for this test that they were doing, or if they knew that this experiment could potentially have detrimental side effects to their own child. But regardless, it happened, and now we know the consequences. And unsurprisingly, the ethics of this experiment were widely criticized, specifically because they used their own human child in such a strange and long-lasting experiment. And while some of the findings from this experiment did end up becoming useful in scientific research of animals and humans, one has to ask themselves, is it worth experimenting on your own child? Is it worth experimenting on any human? Is it worth experimenting on animals? That's a question I'll leave to you. Regardless, the child and the ape experiment is rather unfortunate. And if you can believe it, this is the most tame human experiment we're going to discuss in this list. They only get worse from here, and we're only just getting started. Let's move on. The Little Albert Experiment. In the first experiment, we discussed a child who was not given the proper opportunity to develop like a normal child should, and unfortunately, they became a victim of that. Although in this experiment, we do discuss another child, however, they weren't just not given the opportunity to develop, they were forced to develop negative connections in their brain. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but this is literally a Pavlov experiment that took place on children, not dogs. Let me explain. The Little Albert Experiment was conducted by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner, and took place in 1920. And the point of the Little Albert Experiment was to see if they could condition children to fear something that would typically not provoke fear. Already off to a great start. Watson famously claimed that if he was given 12 newborn children, he could condition them in their upbringing to turn them into any sort of person you could desire. A lawyer, a doctor, a murderer. Anything you wanted a person to be, you could condition them to become that during their early years. I definitely do not think we should be giving John B. Watson any children. Regardless, in the 1920s, somebody did. Watson was able to get his hands on a 9-month-old baby, known as Albert, for his experiment. Watson planned on using classical conditioning methods, also known as Pavlovian conditioning, because it was the same method that Pavlov used to condition dogs. The experiment began with little Albert being placed in a room. Watson, his partner, and a rat were all in this room together, and Watson and his partner simply watched how Albert and the rat would interact. At first, they weren't interested in each other until Albert decided to reach out and touch the white lab rat. It was at that point when Rosalie would strike a metal bar with a hammer, making a loud and scary noise, which would obviously upset Albert. And they would continue to do this time after time in this room every time Albert decided to reach out to the lab rat, until the point where Albert wanted nothing to do with this lab rat. Albert had associated this lab rat with a scary, unpleasant experience. And because of that, this lab rat that he was curious about, he was now afraid of. And not only now was this little Albert afraid of mice, but his fear began to become generalized. They learned this because after the experiment, when they handed Albert a teddy bear, Albert also rejected and gave the same reaction to this fluffy teddy bear that he did to the mouse. And it was theorized that at that point, it wasn't only the mouse that was triggering this negative reaction, but it was any fuzzy object that resembled the white mouse to this baby. Some examples were a white teddy bear, a white rabbit, a small dog, and even a Santa Claus mask. Fortunately, this specific experiment only had one victim. and that was little Albert. There was no control subjects, and the study basically ended there and the paper was published. And while that alone has obvious ethical flaws, once again, the story does not end there. Because Watson was now able to prove that he could condition a child, so what did he do next? Well, naturally, he decided to condition his own children. But he didn't condition his children for fear, but he did have some very interesting parenting philosophies. One of his most popular parenting philosophies was the thought that children should not be given too much attention. Watson believed that you should limit the amount of affection you showed your children. That meant during the day, limiting hugs, no kisses, minimal affirmation, and minimal attention. He literally said that you shouldn't play with your kids because it would disrupt their routine, as if children have routines. He also was a big proponent of sleep training, basically just letting your baby lay in the crib until it cries itself to sleep. Watson believed in all of this, and because he believed this and believed it to be good, he used all of these strategies on his 4 children that he had. Keep in mind, Watson claimed that if he was given newborn children, he could turn them into anything he wanted. So what do you think ended up happening to his 4 children? Let me tell you. Watson's son John suffered from unexplainable migraines and died in his early 50s. His daughter Mary struggled with alcohol abuse almost all of her adult life and attempted to take her life multiple times. Watson's other son James also attempted to take his life, and Watson's 4th child William did take his own life. Candidly, I'm not a parent, but I think it's safe to assume, based off this example and possible common sense, providing your children with a safe, loving environment is likely ideal for them to be raised into happy, healthy people. But what do I know? If you're a parent and you're watching this, let me know your thoughts on this experiment in the comments below. Regardless, the true identity of little Albert was never disclosed. It's unknown whether or not the parents of little Albert knew about the experiment. The long-term effects of this experiment that took place on little Albert are unknown and unfortunately are likely not good based off of the evidence we've seen. And Watson not only unsuccessfully raised his own children, but also influenced an entire generation on how to raise their children, which likely had an interesting impact on society. I think it's important to know that near the end of his life, Watson became rather reclusive and began to denounce a lot of his previous work, stating that he should have not made the books he did or made the claims that he had simply because he didn't have the knowledge yet. And it's even reported that he burned a lot of the physical copies of his experiments that he had in his personal study. You always want to assume the best in people, and maybe Watson just thought that if you gave your children too much affection, they would simply be attention-seeking, unhappy people. And for that reason, if that is truly the case, then it's unfortunate that he made such a detrimental mistake with those that likely meant the most to him. Although there is a very likely possibility that this person simply didn't care about the well-being of people and only wanted the scientific answer he was looking for. I know these entries were a bit similar, and for that reason, I wanted to put them together. Truthfully, I couldn't pick just one to add, so I decided to add both. And because this video gets darker and darker, they obviously had to go side by side. And if you're done hearing about childhood experiments, then buckle up, because this video is about to take a very dark turn. The Aversion Project. If you've watched our first video we made about conspiracy theories, then you'd probably remember me talking about the Canadian gaydar, which was essentially tests that the Canadian government developed to ensure that nobody in the military or police was gay, because if they were, then they were being fired. The Aversion Project was kind of like that, but only unthinkably worse. Like much, much, much worse. The Aversion Project took place in South Africa during the 1970s and 1980s, under the apartheid regime. This entire project was led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, who was a military psychiatrist. And under his control, this entire project was actually carried out by the South African Defense Force, a massive military institution in South Africa. And in the South African military, there was actually a dual policy, which essentially stated that permanent members of the military were not able to be homosexual. You couldn't be gay if you were gonna stay. However, conscripts and temporary members of the military were allowed to be gay. But this isn't because they were a kind and tolerant bunch. The primary reason why this dual policy existed is because the South African military wanted to make sure that nobody was using homosexuality as an excuse to not join the army, which would have likely been very common because at the time, all white men in South Africa were required to serve a certain amount of years in the military. And the government thought if they banned homosexuality, obviously, then all these white men would just be claiming they're gay. Now here's the thing, it doesn't end there. The South African military might have allowed temporary members of the military to, join, as they were legally required to, but another thing they had to do if they were a temporary member of the military who was homosexual is they had to endure forced therapy. And of course, this wasn't talk therapy or to help people suffering from PTSD in the military. This was forced aversion therapy with electric shocks, castration, and even gender reassignment surgeries. The project's ultimate goal was to cure these homosexual military members while they were a member of the military and basically basically at the will of the military. And because of that, they forced them through psychological torture and medical procedures that they did not want to have done. And on top of this, they didn't just do this to people that admitted they were homosexual. They did this to people that they assumed were homosexual. Meaning that if you were a member of the military at this time and people thought that you were being a bit fruity, or if people just didn't like you and wanted a good excuse to literally torture you, they would accuse you of being gay. And at that point, you could be subject to a laundry list of horrific experiments. Some of the most common things that were done were strapping down these alleged homosexuals and showing them homosexual images. Obviously, it doesn't end there. As they would show these victims homosexual images, they would then electrically shock the victim to try to create a negative connection in the brain towards same-sex relationships, which kind of ties into the Little Albert experiment. Which, on top of this shock therapy, some soldiers were chemically castrated by being given a concoction of chemicals that the doctors believed could potentially cure homosexuality, or at least all of their evil urges. And one less popular thing they did that still happened was forced gender reassignment surgeries, where these members of the military were literally subject to hormonal treatments and genital surgeries that would alter their sex against their will, which is disturbing and evil and almost ironic, because they're like, okay, we're gonna take all of the gay people of the military, so we're gonna make them trans. Literally just insane. And it's estimated that anywhere from 500 to 1,000 young men and women were subject to these brutal procedures at the hands of the Aversion Project over the course of the apartheid. It's hard to imagine the sheer terror and agony that was likely being experienced by the victims at this time, but it's even harder to imagine the long-term effects of this essentially torture that took place on these people. There's no doubt that many of the victims that suffered this severe psychological and physical trauma had the rest of their lives altered forever. And specifically for the people that had their genitals mutilated unconsensually, for the percentage of those who survived the surgery, many of them went on to take their own life not long after. The apartheid ended in the 1990s, and the truly disturbing details of the Aversion Project came to light. And Dr. Levin knew he was about to be in big trouble, so he left South Africa and fled to Canada, where he, disturbingly, was able to continue his medical practice. That was until he ironically was convicted of multiple sexual assaults on men. That's right, this person who had been mutilating homosexual and suspected homosexual men and women in South Africa himself was accused by over 30 men of sexual assault. And it was only at that point, after Levin was tried, that he was sentenced to 5 years, which he had already served and he's actually free again, and had his medical license suspended. This story and series of human experiments is truly diabolical. And on top of all of the pain and suffering and discrimination that took place in the South African military, it's almost mind-boggling to me that if Levin didn't assault people in Canada, he would be a free man, and that he served no time or had no legal repercussion for what he did in South Africa. However, I suppose logically it makes sense, because in South Africa, what they were doing was legal. That was the law. If you were gay, you had to go to the military and you had to be cured, or at least treated. So crazy. But at least the story has a bit of a happy ending, because evil people are gonna be evil. And while Levin had a get out of jail free card by going back to Canada, he couldn't go at least a few days without hurting other people. 5 years for over 30 assaults of literal medical patients is not enough in my opinion. The Aversion Project is truly a dark chapter in medical and human rights history. And to this day, the story is a huge reminder of what's possible when you have unchecked power, non-existent morals, and state-backed medical abuse. Before we get to the final entry of this video, I wanted to list a few honorable mentions, or I suppose dishonorable mentions. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was a truly diabolical human experiment, and if you want to learn about that, I actually talked about it in this video about American conspiracy theories. The monster study of 1939, I actually talked about in my first video about human experiments, and the Unit 731 experiment is likely one of the most diabolical human experiments to ever take place. And the only reason why it's not in this video is because I also talked about it in my last video. So I just wanted to address these quickly. Obviously, these are all diabolical human experiments. I'm just not talking about them in this video because I've already mentioned them in other videos. And while we're at it, I just want to say this as well. If you guys enjoyed this video about diabolical human experiments and want more, please let me know in the comments below. Your guys' support is always appreciated, and your feedback is always taken into consideration. But truthfully, I'm just procrastinating at this point because this final entry on the list is literally beyond diabolical. But I suppose let's just rip off the band-aid now. The Nazi medical experiments. This experiment isn't one experiment. It's an entire series of experiments that took place during World War II. And these Nazi medical experiments were carried out in concentration camps under the direction of high-ranking Nazi doctors, primarily Joseph Mengele, who was later known as the Angel of Death. There's a reason why I put this one last. It's important to note that Joseph Mengele was not the only doctor committing these atrocities we're about to get into. There was over a dozen doctors committing horrible human rights violations, and doing so in the name of science, but as you'll see, it's quite far from the truth. Joseph Mengele and the other Nazi doctors performed their experiments on prisoners in the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, which primarily housed Jewish and Romani people. And because the people in these camps were not even seen as humans, to the Nazis, they were essentially less than cattle, and the fact that they were coming in by the trainload every day meant that these doctors had an unlimited supply of research subjects that they could do anything they wanted to. And they took full advantage of this cruel, horrific opportunity. The reasons for these experiments varied greatly, from experimenting on people for the benefit of the military, all the way to personal leisure or interest. There was literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different experiments that were performed on these people by the Nazis to gain random pieces of knowledge. I literally can't explain every single one of them, although I will give a few examples of some of the things they did. One disturbing experiment that the Nazi Party did was they would take someone and then put them into a pressure chamber. A chamber that they could either add air pressure to or remove air pressure from to simulate altitude. And what they would do with these victims in the chamber is raise and drop the pressure significantly multiple times. And the reason they were doing this is to see the effects on the human body of quick altitude changes to further their research on what happens when people jump out of planes. Obviously an advantageous military strategy. The experience for the victim inside the chamber had to be horrific. And unfortunately, after cycles of high and low pressure, the doctors would then take these victims and autopsy them while they were still alive, because they wanted to monitor every part of the body while the heart was still beating. They did this one specific diabolical experiment to over 200 people, 80 of which died during the experiment, and the other 120 that survived were executed immediately after. Another disturbing human experiment that Nazis would do involved hyperthermia. They wanted to better understand how it worked and how to prevent it. And how they went about this was by subjecting people to intense conditions. For some examples, they would put people naked into freezing water, monitoring their vitals until they died of hypothermia. Other examples, they would put people in Nazi uniforms and then put them into cold water to see how effective the Nazi uniforms were at preventing hypothermia. And in some cases, they would put people naked in freezing conditions for up to 14 hours to see what would happen to these people. And for those who did survive the intense cold conditions, they would rewarm these people and then subject them to crazy conditions once again. And how they would rewarm these people varied from heat lamps to boiling water. Similar to the Unit 731 experiment, they also tested diseases, specifically injecting deadly diseases into people to see how they would affect them, and also performing live autopsies on these people so they could see the effects of the disease in real time. Almost all of the surgeries and experiments that were performed by the Nazis were performed without anesthesia, meaning that these victims felt almost every grueling detail of what was happening to them, whether it be a live autopsy, or being boiled alive, or having an experimental sterilization take place on your genitals. I think you get the point, but these Nazi medical experiments were insane. Joseph Mengele personally conducted experiments specifically on twins too, with some of the more common experiments having the goal of either changing eye colors or conjoining siblings by simply removing limbs and trying to connect the two people together. Like I said, I would need probably a multi-day long video to go through the entire list of crazy experiments that took place, but at the end of the day, the total goal of all of these Nazi medical experiments lined up basically with the Nazis' radical ideologies that they had. And the purpose of these experiments was to simply improve the survival chances of German soldiers at war and to find the most effective way to sterilize or exterminate people that weren't Aryan. I could go deeper into excruciating detail, but I truly think you get the idea. The experiments performed by these Nazi medical doctors were so detrimental and so well known that it forced these doctors to be tried during the Nuremberg trials, which individually varied in level of consequences, but in general led to a much stricter medical standard, including the Nuremberg Code, which is essentially a set of ethical principles that must be followed when conducting human experimentation. The Nazi medical experiments were almost unspeakably disturbing, and I can only imagine the acts that didn't make it to the history books. What war was like in every time period. War and violence has been a timeless theme throughout human history, and although war never changes, some aspects of war do. Specifically, fighting styles, weapons, motivations, and other stuff like that. So today, let's learn why and how war evolved over time. The Stone Age. Technically, there isn't much evidence for war in the Stone Age, but I mean, come on. Does anyone think that humans who have been committing atrocities against each other for all of recorded history somehow all of a sudden were just peaches because they were cavemen? Like I said in the beginning of the video, war and violence is just part of the human condition. Thus, it's fair to assume that we still had wars before most of recorded history. And yes, that includes amongst cavemen. And I'm not just pulling this out of my cave, man. There's archaeological evidence for this. But first, what generally started wars in the Stone Age? Well, in the Paleolithic era, prehistoric people were thought to be nomadic, so they didn't really settle down and stay in one place. Because of this, there wasn't much of a reason to go to war. Resources weren't really seen as being one tribe or another tribe's possession, because in order to possess a river, for example, you'd have to live there and make sure that nobody else had access to it. However, in the Neolithic era, which is 10,000 BC to 2200 BC, tribes started to settle down into territories, which makes the potential for war breaking out much more probable in this time period. A lot of this remains speculation because there isn't enough evidence, but some of the proposed causes for war in the Stone Age would include disputes over territory, food, water, and even fights over women. I mean, think about it. If your average low IQ Chad is fighting his best friends over some random woman, imagine how an entire group of savage-ass mammoth-hunting cave gooners would behave. One terrible event that is speculated by historians to be caused by war is the Talheim Death Pit, which dates back to around 5000 BC. In this location, archaeologists found a pit filled with 34 bodies that looked like they were massacred. And if you include the outer ditch of the grave, there were 67 skeletons in total, all of which seem to have blunt force weapons used on their skull. In this site, researchers also found something that looks like a flat wooden paddle called a Thames beater. And no, cavemen weren't getting freaky with this thing. They used these glorified bonk sticks to baba booey their enemies into oblivion. Now, researchers have really only two theories about this event. One of them is that one village took over another to inhabit it. Another theory is that there was a small-scale civil war in the village, and just like Squid Game, the losers died. But they didn't just get their organs harvested here. The losers of this Stone Age battle ended up in a giant skeleton hole. And I'm not just talking about someone's freaky granny here. I'm talking about an enormous grave that looks like it was constructed for the Jolly Green Giant. Interestingly, only about 7 females aged 13 to 40 were found in the grave, which suggests that they may have been abducted. Besides the earlier weapons I mentioned, Neolithic fighters used axes and hammers made of wood, stone, and animal bones. Sometimes they even used farm tools that doubled as weapons. Talk about ingenuity. As we saw from the gravesite, Stone Age war was barbaric, brief, and brutal. And historians hypothesize they preferred guerrilla-style warfare, which, I'll be honest, sounds a lot better than doggy-style warfare. These wars likely either took place in resource hotspots like rivers, tribal villages, or luxury caveman real estate, such as a nice cave. If you think Vietnam-era guerrilla warfare is scary, imagine picking berries in a field somewhere around your village, and then out of nowhere, 200 cavemen incoherently yelling Baba Booey, getting ready to spank your sorry ass with a glorified paddle that would make your Bapsha's slipper feel like a down feather pillow. Doesn't sound fun to me. The Bronze Age. Now that we're in the Bronze Age, we certainly don't have to worry about a lack of evidence because this era has plenty of warfare to cover. In the Bronze Age, society began to see major civilizations starting to organize for the first time, and many historians view this as the dawn of warfare and conflict. Well, official warfare and conflict. As these societies grew more complex and organized, and especially without thousands of years of experience in trading and international business, when one civilization had resources that the other wanted, most leaders' best idea was just to wage war. What resources, you may ask? Well, to begin with, most of the Minecraft basics. Think land, metals, water, loot, and trade routes. Okay, trade routes aren't really in Minecraft, but you get the point. Anyways, quick tangent here, but most people don't consider the importance of rivers in ancient cities. Like all civilizations, rivers and access to water weren't just a want for a booming economy, they were a requirement. Rivers provided reliable access to scalable trade, drinking water, agriculture, and even seafood. And unlike most resources, you can't just trade a river. Thus, war was a natural consequence. One of the biggest wars that took place in the Bronze Age was the Battle of Kadesh. And by studying it, we can gain some insight into what war was like in this time period. But first, does anybody remember the story of Moses in the Bible? Well, the leader of the Battle of Kadesh was Ramses II, which is the same pharaoh from the story of Exodus in the Bible. Although it has been said this battle took place a couple decades before the time period of Exodus, when the pharaoh was younger and probably still better at fighting. You see, Ramses II wasn't happy with all of Egypt's L's in the past century, as Egypt was losing territory to its neighboring empires. So, like all ancient leaders who consider themselves to be gods, Pharaoh launched a wide-scale campaign to regain Egypt's lost territory to restore it to its former glory. Anyways, the Hittites didn't like this, so they made up their own army to counter the Egyptians heading for their land. This story gets long, so I'll try to summarize it the best I can. 2 Hittite spies lied to the Egyptians and told them that their army was far away. And for some reason, the Egyptians totally believed them. The Egyptian army set up camp to chill for a bit. And then, a little while later, the Hittites straight up ambushed them. With no time to prepare, the Egyptians had to improvise with their strategy on the fly. and in a matter of minutes, the Hittite army pretty much broke the Egyptian army into pieces. Now, once the Hittites saw that the army was broken up, they got greedy and started plundering the nearby enemy camps for that sweet Egyptian loot. Now, at this point, I'm guessing Ramses was feeling embarrassed and upset because somehow, against all odds, he escaped from the Hittites surrounding him and reunited with his army. This was probably possible because the Egyptians had lighter and more maneuverable chariots, which gave them a huge competitive advantage in battle over the Hittites' heavy chariots, which probably had the modern-day acceleration equivalent of a Mitsubishi Mirage. Now, I know all of this because Ramses II actually had hundreds of fanboys who sat around all day writing poems about him, like the ancient equivalent of a K-pop stan. Either way though, I respect the rulers in this time period because they actually fought with their army in the battles that they waged, which is pretty cool if you ask me, because no world leaders do that anymore. In the end, it was speculated that nobody really won this battle on either side. Apparently, the war created the world's first peace treaty though, which is pretty cool. If you were fighting a war at this point in history, you'd better hope that you had a good army, because without it, you'd probably be killed by a stray arrow in a matter of minutes. Now that we're no longer in the Stone Age, we have a significant upgrade in our weapons. When talking about weapons in this era, keep in mind that the invention of bronze armor and the bow and arrow changed warfare strategies significantly. For example, if you were a soldier in an ancient Egyptian war, you had to keep your eyes peeled for bowmen and flying arrows at all times. Warfare at the beginning of the Bronze Age was pretty similar to the end of the Stone Age. But even when they did come around to the invention of metal weapons such as the bronze axe, bronze did not always equal better. For example, for most of this time period, most societies still didn't make arrow tips out of bronze because bronze arrow tips were duller than obsidian and more expensive than bone arrow tips. Furthermore, they didn't want to bother spending money on an arrowhead that would probably end up never found again. And as far as other weapons went, a flint mace or axe blow was just as damaging as a strike from a copper one. Because of these reasons, copper knives and swords still coexisted alongside stone, bludgeons, and arrowheads for a long time in the Bronze Age. Warfare was much more organized and strategic than the Stone Age. Armies would use advanced melee formations such as the phalanx, where soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder using shields for protection and striking their enemies with spears and swords. I think we need to talk about how cool chariots were at this point. For example, in the Battle of Kadesh, chariots were a relatively new technology, only having been invented a couple centuries into the Bronze Age. Chariots were basically the world's first car, with only 2 horsepower. And just like modern day cars, chariot technology improved over time. For example, at some point in history, the lighter 2-wheel chariot was a new design that made it faster and more maneuverable than the earlier models. Also, keep in mind that chariots were considered the cool vehicle back then, and most normies in battle didn't even get one. In this era, fortified cities became more common, and with that came the dawn of siege warfare, where the enemies of your kingdom would use battering rams and ladders to try to bypass your city's defenses, and you would have probably been instructed to shoot them with bows and arrows or throw hot boiling oil and stones at them while they try to climb their ladders. Battles in the Bronze Age typically took place in plains and open fields. Was this because everyone became more civilized than simply resorting to guerrilla warfare tactics? No. The leaders of the battles probably just wanted to make sure that there was enough room to do victory donuts in their sweet new chariots after winning the fight. The Iron Age. Well, now we're in the Iron Age, and unsurprisingly, just like the Bronze Age, the Iron Age is categorized by iron. Historians weren't really creative with making these names. In this time period, war was primarily fought over control of resources, as usual, although the definition of valuable resources changed slightly. You see, at every point up until now, fertile land and water was fought for. But now that most people had learned a thing or two about metal forging, valuable minerals like iron were in high demand. Add to this the fact that various religious sects were doing a not very good job at coexisting. While it isn't agreed upon how legitimate it was as an actual event, one famous war that supposedly took place in this time period and has pretty strong evidence for it happening was the Trojan War, a battle between Greece and Troy from the 12th century BC. This battle allegedly broke out after Paris of Troy kidnapped Helen, the wife of the Spartan king Menelaus. Talk about low, dude. Anyways, war in the Iron Age was categorized by double-edged iron swords, spears with iron tips, and even daggers. They used shields constructed of wood and leather, and metal maces. Ouch. Like the other time periods, they used advanced formations in war, making a turtle shell type shape with soldiers' shields. Defensively, cities were within very guarded walls, which might sound like a good idea until you realize that enemies could lay siege on you at any moment. And without water or food coming in, the odds of survival under siege got lowered every single day. Enemies of your city would even build towers to jump the wall, or tunnel under the wall to get within your kingdom. The Iron Age shared a lot of similarities with the Bronze Age, just with some minor and some major developments. The medieval era. In the medieval era, war was waged by monarchs and nobles to gain either political power or to expand their territory. If you've been following along in this video, you've probably noticed a common theme. One of the biggest wars in the medieval period was the Crusades, which in a nutshell were organized by Western European Christians after centuries of Muslim wars of expansion. In the Crusades, the primary objective was to stop the expansion of the Muslim states and reclaim the Holy Land in the Middle East for Christianity, and recapture previously Christian territories. During the medieval era, weapons advanced a lot. Notable weapons of this time period include longswords, lances, which could be thrown from far away, and the Morning Star, which is not as friendly as it sounds. This was a spiky ball on a chain that was designed for crushing knights' armor. Also, they didn't just have mere bows anymore. They had crossbows, which had a huge range advantage, and could even pierce a knight's plate armor. Trebuchets existed too, but unless you were an idiot who got in the way of the projectile path or you lived in a city that it was being aimed at, they weren't really something to worry about. You could probably just run to the side of the field and it wouldn't be able to adjust its aim fast enough. Battles in medieval times were not as chaotic as their depictions in movies and story. As one Redditor pointed out, if you stayed in your crowd, keeping your enemy only in front of you while being surrounded by your friends left, right, and behind, your chances of survival increased heavily. Disciplined and organized shield formations allowed smaller armies to hold off much larger forces than they should have been able to, with coordination and skilled teamwork. Additionally, a small group known as the Charge Cavalry, which consisted of heavily armored knights on armored horses, would break into enemy lines, allowing the rest of the army to seep into the cracks of the battle line in order to divide up the army into smaller groups. Men in most medieval wars throughout history were arranged in the most natural formation, also known as the line formation. The larger the battle is, the more important it was to keep the line together. Shock troops, which were knights with lances, swords, and shields, were intended to break enemy ranks and shatter the infantry. And that is why the battle formation we mentioned earlier were used. Keeping your shields tight to hold the line was the #1 determinant of whether or not you would lose a war. And believe it or not, this was a shock to me, evidence shows that the winners of medieval wars often suffered very minimal casualties. Siege was also an integral part of war at this time, with armies relying heavily on catapults, battering rams, and siege towers. Another tactic that was used that we mentioned earlier was cutting off supplies to the castle that was being besieged. In reality though, medieval warfare was rough. Regardless of ideals of chivalry, the wars in the medieval era were just as or more savage than the ones from previous eras. This is because medieval times were still a transitional period to more structured forms of war. Early modern era. In this time period, military conquest was one way in which monarchs and empires looked to acquire new land and further spread their wings. Wars were fought for all the same reasons as the last, as well as fights for political power struggles between emerging dynasties and nation states, as well as the desire for economic trading dominance. Events such as the War of the Spanish Succession comprised one such cause. In this age, there were many skirmishes between Catholics and Protestants in Europe. Additionally, one famous war from this period was the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648. The 30-Year War was one of the most catastrophic wars in European history. What started as a religious conflict between Protestant and Catholic states within the Holy Roman Empire was soon enlarged into a border dispute involving some of the greatest powers in Europe. This war brought widespread famine, disease, and depopulation, especially in the German states. In 1648, the war finally ended with a treaty known as the Peace of Westphalia. What was war like in the early modern era? Well, the introduction and wide usage of gunpowder weapons pretty much defined war in the early modern era. Muskets, cannons, and other firearms completely changed the nature of combat and rendered most medieval techniques, such as cavalry charges, completely useless. Many battles were characterized by vast formations of troops and a strategy known as the pike and shot, where musketeers fired a bunch of shots while pikemen protected them from enemy cavalry. So basically, it was spawn camping. Heavy artillery like cannons were mainly used in sieges because they could easily break through fortified city walls. Sieges were frequent, as many armies sought to take cities and fortresses of the most strategic importance, sometimes leading to long, exhausting standoffs. Like I mentioned, this time period saw the development of gunpowder weapons. The musket replaced both swords and bows as the primary infantry weapon. Cannons were also used in combat because of their ability to reduce fortifications, essentially destroying them from a safe distance. The first musket was the matchlock musket, but over time it was improved into the flintlock musket because flint was far more reliable. Gunpowder not only influenced the weapons, but also the battle styles of this time period. This change led to linear infantry formations where soldiers stood in a relatively long, straight line to have as much firepower from their muskets as possible. Cavalry units were still sometimes used, although the invention of muskets made soldiers way less privy to undergoing these strategies. And unlike the last era, urban warfare became much more frequent, as developed cities rose to political and economic prominence, like Vienna and Paris. Like mentioned previously, during sieges, food supplies would typically run low, and everyone, including soldiers and civilians, had to survive on whatever was available to eat. Thus, many of them resorted to eating rats, horses, and dogs, and in some cases, entire towns starved to death during extended sieges. The modern era and present day. Modern day, here we go. In the modern era, ideological confrontations came at the forefront of wars, especially during the Cold War, where the clash between capitalism and communism led to numerous proxy wars worldwide. New reasons for war and conflict included oil and other energy commodities and the drive for industrial power. Wars in the 19th and 20th centuries had many examples of disputes over nationalism, self-determination, independence movements, the American Civil War, and decolonization struggles in Africa and Asia. Additionally, warfare in the 21st century saw the rise of terrorism motivated by extremist ideologies and regional grievances. The biggest war in the modern era, of course, was World War II. World War II, from 1939 to 1945, determined the fate of the modern-day world. This war was driven by expansionist ambitions, especially those from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Thus, it naturally clashed with the polar opposite ideologies of fascism and democracy. This war saw countless major battles reverberating throughout Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. And as we all know, it ended with the defeat of the Axis powers and the toppling of the fascist regime, which established the United States of America and the Soviet Union as superpowers in the transitional period into the Cold War. What was war like in the modern era? Modern warfare with today's advanced technologies includes firearms, tanks, aircraft, and missiles, and of course, nuclear weapons. Contemporary wars use any number of variations in attack style, sometimes combining traditional military battle structure with guerrilla warfare.
They're in the tree!
And in the modern day, rifles and handguns are standard weapons to every soldier. Howitzers provide long-range firepower, and missiles, both cruise and ballistic, provide precision strikes against enemy targets. The invention of nuclear weapons opened an entirely new scale of destructive capability that changed the tide, context, and rules of war forever. Recently, cyber warfare tools have been added to the game as well, allowing enemy forces to intercept military secrets, gain intel, and even turn electricity off to enemies via EMPs. Additionally, drones have changed the game in modern battles, such as the FPV bombing drones currently being used in the Ukraine war. Besides this, for battles that take place in 2024, for the first time in history, it's pretty much a prerequisite to be fighting on air, land, and sea. Bonus: the future. This is a new one. In any of our time period videos, we have never covered on a hypothetical future, but for this video, I figured, why not try it out? With that being said, we've covered every era of history we know. What about the final era, the future era? Well, although I'm no time traveler, this is just fictional speculation, but in the future, it is possible that physical land and sovereignty will give way to fighting over digital control and power. In dictatorial countries, this would probably include power over free speech and the suppression of controversial information. Besides this, however, wars will be fought for many, many reasons. Because at this point, we've progressed so far that any reason we fought a war in the past will probably happen again. Future reasons for war, however, could also include future resources that we don't even know about yet. I'll leave you with a hypothetical to help paint the picture. Imagine the year is 2200. Nowadays, oil money is a thing of the distant past. Up until this point, the most sought after resource was lithium, but a recent breakthrough in supercapacitors makes them the new perfect storage for energy. They can be charged for a single second, last for weeks to months, and hold unimaginable amounts of power in a tiny amount of volume. Basically like Tony Stark's nuclear reactor. After outstanding research reports were released from the once Ivy League Musk University, Elon Musk's research and innovation-oriented university founded in 2045, regarding this new invention, it was an absolute sensation around the world, and even more consequential than the invention of the light bulb. However, there's only one problem with this new technology. The new supercapacitor technology that everyone wants requires a rare mineral called potentia that is currently only found in a little island known as Mergui, formerly known as Fiji. In an interesting twist of fate, nuclear weapons have become completely obsolete, as long before Iran and Afghanistan gained power to nuclear weaponry in 2036, the United Nations pooled billions of dollars into research and development for nuclear defense weapons. The technology that came from this was able to deactivate any and all ICBMs by sending supersonic counter missiles at a nearly unlimited number of missiles. And by 2080, nearly all countries in the world have a nuclear iron dome of mutually assured protection. Because of this, and paired with the new breakthroughs in technology to counter radiation and EMFs, warfare reverts back to something like the World War II era of war, but still far more futuristic. In this warfare, close-range combat is relevant again, and ingenuity gives nations a competitive advantage. Thus, this new supercapacitor was the new holy grail for super advanced combat weapons. From looking back in history, we can conclude that a futuristic war for resources would be far different from the historical examples we've covered thus far. In fact, war might never get waged in the first place in this example, as advanced geospecific information warfare could be utilized devised first to either keep it from happening in the first place or brainwash the citizens of Mergui to uprise until their government makes a deal that's in favor of the country that's conducting the brainwashing. This is all a future hypothetical, but I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on it because I think this format could be kind of fun. How to escape North Korea. North Korea is an elusive country, unlike any other. And while a lot of what happens in North Korea is a secret, the cruelty, poverty, and human rights violations are definitely not hidden. North Korea is globally known for its poor treatment of its people and tyrannical dictator. However, the world seemingly just allows it. And that is a topic for a different discussion. But I mention this all to say that North Korea is not a good place. And for that reason, it's unsurprising that every single day people try to escape this country. Those people are known as defectors. The record of North Korean defectors goes all the way back to 1998, with a recorded count of 947 people escaping the country. From 1998 all the way up until 2011, we saw a rise in the amount of people that were able to escape, with a peak number of defectors of 2,914 in 2009. But after 2011, the number started to float around 1,500 and shrank all the way down to around 1,000 defectors in 2019. However, after 2019, the amount of people that were able to successfully escape plummeted. The reason for such a dramatic drop in escapees is North Korea enacted a shoot-on-sight order that essentially gave all Border Patrol the authority to shoot any person in the buffer zone surrounding North Korea who was there without permission. Escaping North Korea is scary and truly deadly, especially now more than ever. But for some living in North Korea, that risk is worth taking, and they'd rather die on the pursuit of freedom than living under the control of a dictator. Since 1998, there have been over 34,000 people in total who have been able to escape North Korea successfully. And today, I'm going to discuss some of the craziest ways that these people accomplished such a feat, starting tame and getting crazier as the list goes on. Leveraging wealth and social class. You are a high-ranking government official, specifically working with state-run businesses. You are one of the extremely rare, wealthy North Koreans, at least relatively, and you experience privileges many North Koreans could never dream of. Not only do you have a comfortable dwelling and consistent access to quality food and clean water, but you also have access to something that almost resembles freedom. You work tireless days, and sometimes even nights, and you are quite literally being worked to the bone. However, every day on your commute, you realize how grateful you are to be in the position you're in. And while you are grateful for your position, you understand that even the best position in North Korea still isn't all that great. And for some time, while on business, specifically in mainland China, you've seen the difference in quality of life, and you've been slowly taking notes on how you could potentially leave your job. Your job grants you a lot of authority, and you are well connected, not only with the North Korean government, but with government officials and high-ranking businessmen in China. One night, while drinking at a bar in mainland China, half asleep, a man sits beside you. He doesn't say anything, but he hands you his card. You tell this man that you're not on business hours and you appreciate it, but you're just looking to relax. And the man sternly looks you in the eyes and says, "I know you're North Korean, and if you ever want to start a new life, you call this number." This moment was sobering, as this man wasn't speaking to you in Mandarin. He was speaking fluent Korean. And before you could even ask another question, he got up and left. You wake up the following morning, early, hungover in this Chinese hotel. You briefly remember that crazy dream you had last night until you reach into your pocket and feel that you actually got that card and that wasn't a dream. You get in the taxi and make your way back to the airport. And on your way back to North Korea, the only thing you could think of is the offer this man gave you. You assume he had to be a defector, as no mainland Chinese person would speak such perfect Korean, specifically with a North Korean accent. And nobody would recognize the fact that you were North Korean or make you such a preposterous offer unless they were sure, likely because they were in a similar situation. You get home and you're happy to see your family. And after putting your children to bed and once again going to bed late, you sit beside your wife in bed and tell her a secret. You tell her that you met somebody in China and this person could change their lives. You explain to your wife who you met and what they offered, and you notice that your wife doesn't look enthusiastic. She looks shocked. And before you could ask your wife what she thought about the possibility of potentially starting a new life and leaving North Korea, she jumps out of bed and begins screaming. She is completely repulsed by the idea that you could potentially ever want to leave the greatest nation. And she's convinced that you must be brainwashed and that you must be reported reported to the government immediately. Your wife is either brainwashed or simply terrified of what could happen to her if her husband was testing her loyalty to North Korea, or if anybody happened to be listening. Regardless, your wife grabs the phone and immediately starts dialing. You grab the phone and tell her that you were kidding. You were kidding. You were only simply testing her because nobody loved North Korea more than you, and you wanted to test your wife's loyalty to North Korea to make sure your marriage was strong. This seems to calm your wife and you both go to bed. And it's at that moment when you realize that if you were to leave North Korea, you're doing it alone. Your next trip to mainland China isn't for another 6 months, but the following day at work, you convince your boss that you have unfinished business in China, and it's best for the company if you return as soon as possible. The following week, the opportunity arises, and you're back in China. You take out the card and you give it a call. You meet the man at the same bar that you're at. After your first night in China, you call the number on the card that you were given, and you're met with an automated voice message saying coordinates and a cash value. You assume that the coordinates are where you're supposed to meet someone, and you assume that cash value is the fee required for your freedom. You meet up with this man once again, and over the course of the week you're supposed to be doing business, you get a fake Korean passport, and you are given a dedicated travel guide, aka your new wife, whose sole job is to get you to the airport safely and make sure that you are able to catch a flight from mainland China to South Korea. This isn't the woman's first rodeo, and she's able to get you through security checkpoints and past suspicious Chinese government officials, as her Chinese is perfect, and her story for why she is hanging out with a South Korean man checks out. You get dropped off at the airport by this mysterious woman, and when she drops you off at the airport, she says, "Never come back." You board your flight to South Korea, and your new life has begun. So yeah, this is obviously a hypothetical story, but it's an example of exactly how someone could use their wealth, connections, and status to escape North Korea. This method of escape is the most effective, the safest, and also the least common, because privileged individuals in North Korea simply are hard to come by. And the percentage of those that would even consider leaving or betraying North Korea is even smaller. However, it has been done, and it needed to be mentioned. In this story I just told, I outlined a mysterious man, and this man represents a very real person and industry that exists, known as escape brokers. And their entire business model is essentially smuggling people out of North Korea, obviously for a hefty fine. However, if you're a wealthy individual, then that is a small price to pay for your freedom and for your safety, because the other methods of escape we're going to be discussing are not nearly as plush as this. The reason why this mysterious woman, who was an employee of this smuggling company, gave you a South Korean passport was, one, because it was a perfect excuse of why somebody in China would be speaking Korean, and secondly, because it raised no red flags of why a South Korean would be going to South Korea from China. If this man decided to fly from mainland China to South Korea with a North Korean passport, it is highly likely that the Chinese government would be extremely suspect of this and you would be questioned. Specifically because China has very close relations with North Korea, and also has a treaty in place where any escapees from North Korea that make it to China will be returned to North Korea by the Chinese government. So yeah, even if you are able to simply escape to China from North Korea by any means, you're definitely not free, but that's something we'll discuss later. The example I gave in the beginning focuses on businessmen or government officials who are able to essentially network with influential and powerful people and also have access to money. But there are other ways you can leverage class and status to escape, notably being high-level athletes or privileged students from these rich families who are able to both work and study abroad. In these cases, when you are out of North Korea, you can simply just not go home. And depending on where you are abroad, you can be protected, and in some cases, even given citizenship as a refugee, allowing you to start a brand new life. One more thing I want to mention is the fact that in the story I gave, this character had kids. And if you're familiar with North Korean law, then you know that the North Korean government likes to punish not only you, but also your family for your crimes. And in the instance of the story I gave initially, the reason why the man was so able to confidently leave North Korea is because he used a high-level escapee broker. And one of his services that they include in their price is faking your death. So instead of being seen as an escapee by the North Korean government, this mysterious man was able to make it look like you died doing business abroad. And for that reason, your family is spared. And while this entire situation is hypothetical, the core of these conditions is based in reality. And while this man's family was spared in this instance, that is not always the case. One of the reasons this man was even allowed to travel internationally for business is because he had a family. And to the North Korean government, that is something that they see as collateral. Because if this man has a wife and kids, he is much less likely to just defect. Because the man knows that if he defects, his family will be tortured and killed on his behalf. And for most, that is reason enough to stay. Regardless, let's move on. International labor camps. You're a skinny, single, young man living in the northern part of North Korea. You're an orphan and you work on a farm. You've been working at this farm for as long as you can remember, and the people that live at this farm are the closest thing you have to family. But as you get older, it seems the worse the treatment gets, and it seems that the more work you put in, the less that you get paid. You're a full-grown man now, but the meals you get served are still the portion size you got when you were a child, and at this point, you're almost skin and bones. You've tried begging and pleading with the owners of this farm for more food, as they are the only ones providing your meals. However, they're not budging. They tell you should be grateful for what you get, and while they're not in any better of a situation, you realize that if you stay here, you're going to die. So one night, you plan your escape. Not from North Korea, but just from this farm. Under the veil of night, you escape on a dirt road with a burlap sack on your back and the rags that you've had for your entire life. You find yourself in a small village and soon realize that your money did not go nearly as far as you thought it would. So to conserve money, you decide to steal. And while it isn't like you at all, it's life or death, and you're able to justify it. And you fill your bag with food from a stand in the city square, from the village farmer's market. Before you could even close your bag, you feel two hands on your shoulder and turn around. It's a police officer, and good news, you'll have a place to sleep tonight. Bad news, you're going to jail. You're brought into jail, booked, and because of your retaliation, the punishment that you're given is 2 years in a labor camp in Russia. After 2 cruel weeks in a holding cell, you're put on a train and sent to northern Russia, where you're going to be spending the next 2 years on a lumber mill. You arrive at this mill and realize that this camp is almost fully employed by North Korean criminals, which gives you some relief as you at least have somebody to talk to, because you were expecting Russians. And while all of the guards are heavily armed Russians, those are really the only Russians around you, as this labor camp is in an extremely remote area. On your first night in the camp, you speak to one of the other North Koreans, and he tells you that you came at the perfect time, and that him and the other men at this labor camp have been planning an escape for years. And tomorrow night was the night that they leave, and that if you were brave enough, you could come with. You had no intentions of leaving North Korea and ended up in Russia by accident, but at this point, you had nothing to lose. The cold weather was unbearable, you can't stand farm work anymore, and even dying at this point sounds better than working in a Russian labor camp. You tell the man you're in, and he says, "We'll wake you up tomorrow night." You work the next day and go to bed the next night, and like he said, in the middle of the night, this man wakes you up quietly. Similar to something you did yourself not long ago, under the veil of night, you and a small group of these North Korean prisoners set off in the middle of the night. Leaving the labor camp wasn't the hard part, as security was relatively low due to the location of this labor camp and the assumption that if anybody were to leave, they would be dead within days, as the closest civilization was multiple days away on foot. And all of these cities had police that specifically do checks for North Koreans. Walking through this frozen, barren wasteland, you ask this man, "What is the plan? Where are we going? If Russian police find us, we will be sent back to North Korea. They are allies." And that's when this man reveals his master plan. Some of the criminals you are with have been in this prison for so long that they speak fluent Russian. And because of the Russian that this prisoner picked up, in the months of listening to guards, they were essentially able to map out not only where the train tracks are, but the train schedule as well. After hours of walking in the darkness, day begins to break, and you notice that your group is already smaller. 2 of the men that were in your group initially were no longer, and it's mutually assumed that they fell behind and froze to death. You and your remaining men find the train tracks, wait for the next train taking wood out of the labor camp, hop on one of the very last carts, and you are now, once again, on your way to freedom. Wow. In this hypothetical, you're in a similar situation as the first person, but obviously on a much different scale. Because you didn't even intentionally go abroad, you were just sent abroad by the government, and you had no expectations of fleeing at all. You simply accepted your fate, but you were at the right place at the right time. And fortunately, the people that you trusted had the perfect plan. Did the person in this hypothetical have ridiculous plot armor? Of course. But I figured in these fictional scenarios, obviously based on reality, it would make sense to have them at least escape at the end of the story. Because if all the stories ended with, "and they were caught and killed," well, it's not really a good example of how to escape. It's how you could try to escape and then die, which is the unfortunate reality for most. But yeah, labor camps exist, and obviously they exist all over North Korea, but some of them are abroad, and they are primarily in Russia. And while nobody wants to be at a Russian labor camp, there are North Koreans who see going to a Russian labor camp as a golden opportunity to escape their country. And it's for that reason that the North Korean government is very stingy on who they send abroad. And in most cases, you're not going to be sent to an abroad labor camp. And the only reason why you in this story were even sent abroad is because you have farm experience, you've worked in cold conditions before because you lived in a northern part of North Korea, and according to your documents, you still had a living family, which is a requirement to be sent abroad. And obviously you were an orphan since birth and don't know any of your family. Legally speaking, you still had a living family, so the government assumed you had loyalty to them, which made you a much lower escapee risk. Of course, getting to Russia is similar to getting to China. You are not necessarily fully free in these countries. You're more free, but these are still countries that have close ties to North Korea. And you are at risk for being caught and being deported back to North Korea, where you'll be punished severely. And in this instance, you and the other criminals who made it to this train were taking a train that took you out of Russia and into Europe, as Europe has no allegiance to North Korea, much like the rest of the Western world. And if you're able to make it through Russia into a European country, and from there find a South Korean embassy, at that point, it's safe to say you're safe and are going to win yourself a one-way ticket to South Korea. The reason why South Korea is so desirable for North Koreans is because South Korea gives automatic citizenships to North Korean escapees, and at least the government accepts these people with open arms. Socially, there is definitely polarity on how people treat defectors, but a bit of scrutiny for being North Korean is definitely better than living in North Korea. So at this point, let's reconsider. Obviously, going north isn't ideal, because if you use the small border that borders North Korea and Russia, not only is it extremely well guarded, cold, and far from any sort of safe haven, it's only really a good option for those looking to get into a labor camp, as being sent to a labor camp allows you to cross the border safely. And now we also understand that going through China, another country that borders North Korea, is also not ideal, because that border, once again, is highly guarded. And because of the connection that China has with North Korea, you're essentially still in North Korea until you're out of China, which means that you have a long ways to travel before you can really take a breath and relax. But that leaves the natural question. What about the last country that borders North Korea? Why not escape to the country that everybody wants to go, that gives you immediate asylum and citizenship? South Korea is literally connected to North Korea. It's not freezing cold. It's a country that will accept you. And this country also has people that speak the same language as you. It seems like the perfect way to escape. And while on paper, you're definitely right, there's one major issue. You're not the only person that understands this. The North Korean government understands this quite dearly. And that's why there's a demilitarized zone that stretches the entire land border of North Korea and South Korea. And while that name seems semi-safe, it's extremely deceptive, as this border is not demilitarized at all. It is very militarized. There is so much military from both North and South Korea. There is literally hundreds of thousands of soldiers on either side of this border. And in the area in between these two countries, there is active landmines, electric fences, and watchtowers with the executive order to shoot on sight. So let's get into our third and final story to outline likely the craziest and deadliest way you could escape North Korea. Escaping by land as a regular North Korean citizen. You, like many other North Koreans, are simply sick and tired of being sick and tired, and you decide you're gonna make a run for it. You live near a remote part of the border, where there are active personnel, but it's not as heavily monitored as other places. You pack a bag and set out on foot, feeling confident that you can make this land crossing. You don't see anybody, and you figure this is gonna be a walk in the park, and after hours of walking, you realize that you don't even exactly know where the border is, and for all you know, you might already be in South Korea. You walk further and further, and finally begin to feel free. You must have at this point passed the border, until you see something in the distance. You walk closer to it and you realize that it's a sign that says active minefield. And it's at this point that you realize that you are much further from the border than you thought, and you have a long ways to go. You call the sign's bluff and continue walking. And after taking a few steps and walking for 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes, you knew there was no mines and continue walking. And you're right, there was no mines, but there was snipers. Snipers that you didn't see, but they saw you. And before you can even blink, you hear a gunshot and everything goes black. Unfortunately, that is a reality for people trying to cross the land border between North and South Korea. Crossing over the water as a regular North Korean citizen, You're a young woman fed up with living in North Korea. You've been abused your whole life, and at this point, you feel that anything is better than your current existence. You studied geography in school and understand that the waters on the west coast of North Korea where you live are much more favorable than the east coast for fishermen. But if fishermen favor it, must be a reason, and the waters must be calmer, which must mean it's easier to escape. One night you head down to a local dock and brazenly steal a boat. You simply head south and plan on running into the South Korean Coast Guard. Although hours into your trip on this boat, you get caught up in a storm and you lose your motor. At this point, you're stranded at sea at the mercy of the ocean. There's essentially 3 outcomes that are possible, and I'll just go through them quickly. Option 1, you wash up on shore. You think you're in South Korea, but you're actually still in North Korea, and you're killed. The tide takes you north, and you wash up on shore in China, where you are found by police, deported to North Korea, and killed. Or, if you are extremely fortunate, you do wash up on shore in South Korea and begin a new life. Or, option 4, you lose your life at sea, either due to harsh conditions or by being caught by the North Korean Navy, which heavily patrol these waters because of people like yourself, escaping via the land border as military personnel. The story I'm about to tell is not a fictional hypothetical like the others. The story I'm about to tell is a real story about a real individual, and is likely one of the craziest known escape stories from North Korea into South Korea. Oh Chung-sung was a high-ranking military official in North Korea who was also an industrial engineer. He had a good job and was considered good at that job, but obviously he wasn't satisfied. And one day, he met his breaking point and was willing to risk his life for his freedom. On the morning of November 13th, 2017, Sung stole a military jeep from the military base where he worked, heading directly for the demilitarized zone, the area between North and South Korea, aiming to get into South Korea and begin a new life, in a way that is regarded as likely the most dangerous way. Although Sung did have an advantage, being military personnel, he was able to be very close to the border. He had security access and a relatively comprehensive knowledge of how things worked. Although, even with all of the knowledge in the world, you need luck and likely God on your side to even make this possible. And on this morning, Sung definitely had both. Sung sped this military jeep directly at the border, crashing through fences and driving right through no man's land. And while approaching freedom and seemingly having a perfect escape, his car lost a wheel. He hit a ditch on the side of the road and was immobile, and had to continue his escape on foot. Sung was close to the border, but he did have North Korean officials tailing him closely, and they were shooting to kill. Sung officially crossed the border, although with 5 bullet holes in his body, and was able to crawl behind a small barrier where he collapsed and stayed seemingly lifeless for hours. Later that day, the South Korean military conducted a rescue operation and strategically transported him via air to a hospital and saved his life. In the hospital, it was discovered that he was shot 5 times and lost over half of his blood, and that if he did not receive this emergency surgery, he would have died there. Sung's story is extremely well documented, and this entire situation was actually caught on camera due to the sheer amount of surveillance on the North and South Korean border. And Sung is definitely one of the luckiest people to ever cross the North Korean border illegally. If you are living in North Korea currently, well, truthfully, you're not watching this video. But if you're curious about how people have successfully and unsuccessfully escaped North Korea in the past, hopefully this video gave you a bit of context, and did so in a way that was entertaining due to the hypothetical stories that I basically just made up, but obviously based on reality, for the most part. The craziest prison escapes from around the world. The year is 2030, and you and the love of your life are looking out of the window of a luxury helicopter at the beautiful landscape of southern France. Doesn't that just sound like the best vacation ever and a dream come true? Now imagine this. Swap luxury helicopter for old hijacked helicopter, swap the love of your life for one of your co-conspirators, and swap helicopter tour with prison escape. And while you're still in the south of France, you're in a much different situation. And this situation is one of the craziest French prison escapes ever. Our story begins on July 7th, 1963, when our protagonist Pascal Payet was born. And while Pascal had a relatively normal childhood in the south of France, it wasn't long before he started his criminal career and lived a life that was anything but normal. In 1988, at the ripe age of 25, Pascal was convicted of his first crime, aggravated assault. And only 5 years later, in 1993, he was once again convicted of conspiracy. But it wasn't until 4 years after that, on November 20th, 1997, when Pascal's story truly began. Pascal Pascal and a group of other French criminals planned and executed an attack on an armored vehicle for the Bank of France. The robbery of this armored vehicle was anything but smooth, and during the robbery, one of the guards of this vehicle was killed, turning a robbery case into a murder case and beyond. Pascal and his associates were able to leave the scene of the crime successfully that day, but they weren't free for long, because in 1999, Pascal, along with his associate Eric Alborio, were found and arrested in Paris. I want to emphasize, all of this is horrible, and he definitely deserves to be in jail, but it's crazy that already this guy is literally living like it's GTA France. But if you think the actions that got Pascal into jail were GTA-esque, just wait until I tell you how he got out of jail. It is January 1999, and Pascal has just arrived in Lithuania. He sees a structure begin to appear outside of the prison bus window. This is a maximum security French prison, and it has existed for over 2 centuries, seeing over the years the craziest list of almost any criminal you could imagine. The history of this place alone is insane, and with centuries to refine their techniques, they were no amateurs when it came to holding and punishing criminals. This prison was built and rebuilt numerous times throughout the last 2 centuries, and its most recent iteration was regarded as one of the most technologically advanced prisons in all of France, and it was considered escape-proof. And if you watched our first video about prison escapes, then you know that escape-proof prisons are not a title, they're a challenge. And to Pascal, that challenge seemed enticing. As Pascal has walked into his cell and sat on his bed, the guards uncuff his ankles and wrists, slam the door behind them, and Pascal is now officially in his new, all-expenses-paid home in the south of France. And the timer has officially begun. To the French government, the timer is counting down the amount of days that Pascal has left to serve. However, in Pascal's brain, a different timer has begun. The timer to plan an escape. And while Pascal had 30 years to sit and think about his plan, it only took him 2 years to theorize and execute his grand escape. Or escapes, I should say. It is October 12th, 2001, and it has been 2 years since Pascal has been behind bars. And over this time, he has been coordinating strategically with one man on the outside, a man named Frederick Impoko. And together, they put together a plan to quickly and easily take Pascal out of this prison. And today was the day they executed the plan. The plan began with Impoko hijacking a helicopter and flying it over top of the prison. The helicopter then quickly landed in a designated part of the courtyard where Pascal would enter the helicopter and the two would fly away into freedom. Although the plan didn't go that smoothly, because although they both got away successfully out of the jail, only 6 days later, Impoko was detained and taken in for questioning. But while Impoko was now behind bars, Pascal was a free man once again. But unfortunately, he still needed to make a living now that he was on the outside. And he dove right back into the only career he knew, stealing. And for 2 years, while on the run, Pascal would rob small-time jewelry stores and live off the profits from his heists. But after those 2 years, he must have began to get lonely, or maybe he felt bad for leaving his associates behind. Because on April 14th, 2003, Pascal decided that being free alone wasn't good enough, and he wanted to free some of his friends as well. And that is exactly what he did. Pascal once again organized a helicopter escape from the exact same prison that he escaped from 2 years earlier. This time, he was already free, and he was now freeing 3 other men. The same men that were involved in the bank truck heist in 1997. And once again, a helicopter was hijacked, flown over top of the prison, quickly landing to pick up the criminals, and then flying off into the sunset. But once again, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, because this time, it wasn't just one of the men that were caught. 3 weeks after this second helicopter prison escape, all of the men were caught. There's absolutely no question that Pascal is a bad man, but he's definitely a good friend to his fellow criminals, proving that maybe there is honor among thieves after all. Interestingly, while imprisoned, once again, Pascal decided to take another approach, and instead of planning another escape, he decided to write a blog post. A blog post specifically about the mistreatment he was experiencing in the French prison system. He complained that the conditions he was experiencing was poor, and he was also complaining of being transferred so many times, specifically being transferred 9 times in 30 months. And in combination with this letter, he also went on a hunger strike in one of these prisons because he didn't want to be moved again. These attempts were unsuccessful, but they, happened. At this point, Pascal is behind bars for good, right? He was able to coordinate 2 separate helicopter escapes, and at this point, he is now serving so much time behind bars. Like, seriously, after all of the dust had settled, Pascal was facing 30 years for the murder that happened on the truck in 1997, 6 years for the jailbreak that happened in 2001, 7 years for busting his friends out in 2003, and now he's resorted to writing blog posts and not eating. So now he's not only mentally given up, but also physically frail. There's no way that he's, going to have any other escapes, right? And the answer is, of course not. By the time that July 2007 rolled around, Pascal was one of the most closely monitored prisoners in all of France, and for good reason. And what that looked like was consistent surveillance by guards and also being placed permanently in solitary confinement. In combination with both of those measures, Pascal was also moved every 6 months to new prisons so that he couldn't formulate a plan for too long, which also ironically increased his transfer frequency, something he was trying to get reduced with his hunger strike and letter. Regardless, even with all of these measures in place, Pascal still had a bit more fight in him. And on July 14th, 2007, on Bastille Day, a national holiday in France, Pascal made his final escape. If you're unfamiliar with Bastille Day, imagine the 4th of July, but in France. Fireworks, food, friends, family, just a lot of festive things. And while many see this as an opportunity to relax, Pascal saw this as an opportunity to get to work. And work he did. Because while all of the festivities were happening outside and law enforcement were already busy enough with all of the festivities happening, 4 men in ski masks were quickly approaching a French airport to once again hijack a helicopter. These men were successful. They kidnapped a pilot, hijacked the helicopter, and forced this pilot to fly over the prison that Pascal was currently in. The helicopter once again landed in the prison. The men went into the prison and freed Pascal from his solitary confinement, and in only 5 minutes after arriving, the helicopter was flying out of the jail. The criminals forced the pilot to fly 40 kilometers northeast to a location on the Mediterranean coast, where they had the pilot land the helicopter, and the pilot and the helicopter were free. And unfortunately, so was Pascal Payet. 2 days after this escape took place, a Europe-wide arrest warrant was placed against Pascal Payet, and even still, it took over 2 months for Pascal to be caught. However, on September 21st, 2007, in a suburb of Barcelona, Spain, Pascal was caught and once again put into French custody, where he remains to this very day. This story is almost picture perfect and kinda has everything you want. A beautiful European landscape, helicopters, crime, suspense, helicopters, friendship. It's really got it all, and I knew for that reason I had to make it the first entry on this list. Because seriously, how do you have 3 consecutive prison escapes all involving hijacked helicopters? Like, if nothing else, you've got to admit that this guy is consistent. Pascal found his method and just worked it till he couldn't anymore. What I find crazy is now, after the 3rd successful helicopter escape, the police have decided that they're going to make the location of Pascal private for security reasons, obviously to avoid a 4th helicopter escape, which I think is logical and possibly a bit, late, but I guess still worth doing. But yeah, it's just crazy to think that there's a good chance that Pascal could have been a free man after his first successful helicopter escape. At the time, he was behind bars and facing 30 years for a murder that took place in 1997, but decided that even though he was free, he wanted to go back and help his 3 friends escape as well, which is something I really wish I knew the motivation behind, but I guess that is kind of up to speculation. He could have freed his friends because, he wanted his friends to have the same freedom as him, or maybe because he was, as a free man still living a life of crime, he wanted his crime friends back so he could, have more people to commit crime with. It's really up in the air on his motivation, but regardless, he did it. And now, as of today, his laundry list of charges goes as follows: 30 years for the murder, 6 years for jailbreak 1, 7 years for jailbreak 2, 5 years for jailbreak 3, and on top of all of these, an additional 15 years for all of the robberies that took place while he was a free man. At that point, he would have been better off just serving his initial 30 years. But I guess the moral of the story here is crime never pays. Now, what do you get when you mix 2 charming, intelligent, cold-blooded killers, a lonely and vulnerable prison employee, and paper-thin prison walls? Well, you'd be getting our next story. Richard Ricky Matt was born on June 25th, 1966, and grew up in foster care in Buffalo, New York. His childhood was anything but desirable. Throughout the course of his adult life, he had served multiple prison sentences that were shorter term. But once he was free again after serving his time, he decided that his best course of action was to get a job and then 2 weeks after working there, rob, kidnap, and murder his boss. And after this murder, he fled to Mexico, where he, a year later, robbed and killed another man. For this second murder, he received a 23-year sentence. But in 2007, Richard was extradited back to the United States, where he received a 25 to life sentence for his first murder, the murder of William Rickerson, the man who tried to give his convict a career and an opportunity, only to be robbed, kidnapped, and murdered and dismembered by the man he was only trying to help. Regardless, Richard was convicted of second-degree murder and was sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. David Paul Sweat was born on June 14th, 1980, in Binghamton, New York State. He was raised by a single mother and grew up with 2 sisters, and from a child, he was a troubled individual. Even as young as 9, David was demonstrating extremely violent tendencies, and for that reason, his mom sent him to Florida to live with his uncle, which resulted in David stealing and wrecking his aunt's car, and his aunt and uncle then sending him into foster care. During his late teens, Sweat was essentially homeless, living off of any money he could make selling weed. And it was during this time that he began planning elaborate burglaries. And throughout his late teens in the 1990s, Sweat was arrested and sent to prison multiple times where he served his sentences. But on the 4th of July in 2002, Sweat, his cousin, and a third accomplice decided that they would cash in on the profits of 4th of July and robbed a fireworks store in Pennsylvania. Not to steal fireworks, however, but to steal guns. These 3 men were successfully able to steal the firearms. And that night, after the robbery, drove from Pennsylvania back to New York State, where they planned on splitting up the loot. The 3 men pulled into a dimly lit parking lot where the others' cars were parked, and they began to divide up the loot. But while transferring guns from one of the cars to the other, a police officer spotted what was going on and decided to investigate. As the police officer began to approach the man, Sweat opened fire on the police officer, but didn't kill him. That was until Sweat decided to run over this police officer with his vehicle and then drive away. After Sweat was gone, Sweat's cousin decided to then shoot the police officer in the head again. The men all left the parking lot, but fortunately, only a few days later, all 3 men were caught. Sweat pled guilty to avoid the death sentence and was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was too sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility. I'm sure you're already seeing a bit of similarities and differences between these 2 horrible people. Richard and David both spent time in foster care, both had violent tendencies, and both had numerous run-ins in the law and spent time in prison before the time they ever even met, which leads us to when they did meet, which obviously took place within the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. And unfortunately, these 2 didn't only serve time together, but formed a rather twisted friendship, and shortly after bonding, began planning their escape from prison. At the beginning of this story, I did mention that these men were intelligent and charming, and unfortunately, that is the case for most psychopaths, something that obviously both of these men were. They had no empathy, no remorse, and no issue killing innocent people for their own gain. But another key component of psychopaths are their tendency to manipulate people, and that tendency to manipulate was a huge factor in the eventual escape of Richard and David. And that escape in question is kind of a blend of the very real Alcatraz escape that I actually talked about in the first prison escape video and the fictional Shawshank Redemption prison escape. Early on in their plans to escape, they both knew that if they wanted to escape, they were going to need some serious help. And because of this, the first step in their plan involved manipulating somebody on the inside to begin helping them. And that person on the inside was Joyce Mitchell. Mitchell was an older woman working as a supervisor in the Taylor department of the prison. And for reasons unknown to us, Richard and David decided that she was the perfect person to convert to their side. And how they went about doing this was extremely upsetting because they used not aggression or fear, but love. Both of these men individually began to develop intimate relationships with Joyce Mitchell within the prison. And over time, were able to get her to begin helping them by providing supplies, specifically by getting tools out of the prison workshop, hiding them in burger meat, and delivering them to these 2 criminals. Now, I don't want to make Joyce Mitchell kind of sound like the innocent victim in this story because it did come out that there was a plan that David and Richard would kill Joyce's husband. But yeah, don't think of her as some victim. She was complicit in this. But just imagine the sheer riz of these 2 men. Like, Mitchell has a husband, a job, and somehow she was able to be manipulated and convinced by 2 criminals that the best course of action of her was to aid these criminals in their escape, and once these criminals escape, they can kill her husband and then all go to Mexico together. Like, that is crazy level manipulation. Once Richard and David had Mitchell on their side, their plan was in full effect. And from that point, it only took 6 months for that plan to be executed. Over these 6 months, Mitchell would slowly bring different tools and components into the jail cells of each of these men, and possibly do other things as well. Regardless, once these men had the tools, they were able to begin chipping away at their very own cell walls. Similar to the Alcatraz escapes, both of these men developed holes in their cells under the sink where they could slip into the endless labyrinth of tunnels existing within the prison. The men were quickly able to access the tunnel system behind the walls. However, it took most of that 6 months to develop a plan on exactly where to go in the tunnel system, and also to cut holes into huge steam pipes that they would eventually climb through for their escape. There's actually an investigation video showing 2 investigators going from the prison cell to the manhole cover, showing exactly how long and tight and uncomfortable this entire journey is. And it took the investigators only 20 minutes to get through all of it. This includes going down 6 stories via catwalks and pipes, and then traveling across the pipeline, going through small holes in the wall between blocks until they eventually get to a huge steam pipe that they likely took months to cut a hole into. And how they would do this is literally every night, making this entire journey to make slight holes in the pipe until they could finally cut the whole chunk of metal out of the pipe. And then eventually, once they could go into this pipe, they were able to climb through it, enter the final room that led them to essentially a sewer under the road, roughly 150 meters outside of the prison, where they could climb a ladder, raise the manhole cover, and be free. But the story doesn't end there, because even though Mitchell, up until this point, only brought the men tools. She also was supposed to be the getaway driver. But on the night of the escape, Mitchell had a panic attack, thought she was having a heart attack, and went to the hospital. So a different prison employee actually ended up being their getaway driver. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. On June 5th, 2015, at 10:30 p.m., both Matt and David were accounted for in the nightly head count at the prison. However, the next morning on June 5th at 5:50 a.m., during morning count, they were unaccounted for, and the search began. It only took a few hours for the prison to notice the external breach. They had only 150 meters outside of the prison wall. It was the obviously open manhole cover that had led directly to the basement of the prison. Due to this discovery, it didn't take long for investigators to find out exactly how Richard and David escaped. Interestingly, when the investigators were looking through the tunnel system that they used to escape, they found an interesting note. It was simply a piece of paper that said, "Have a nice day," and drawn below that was a racist Asian smiley face with a triangular rice hat, which is just odd. But now the men were free, but their plans were still not completed. The original plan was to murder Mitchell's husband and then flee to Mexico. But with Mitchell in the hospital and them having a completely different getaway driver, they decided their best bet was to go to Canada. But they couldn't just go straight there, and they had to take their time. And during that time, roughly 3 weeks, there was an extensive manhunt that was established by both the American and Canadian governments to make sure that these two men did not escape. 20 days after the initial escape, one of the two men was spotted for the first time. Richard Matt was spotted in Franklin County, New York. He was spotted because he was shooting at traffic with a 20-gauge shotgun taken from a hunting camp. Obviously, when you shoot at pedestrians, the police are going to get involved. And shortly after, Matt was shooting at civilians. The police shot and killed Richard. But that's only Richard. At the time of Richard's death, David's location was still unknown, and the investigation was still well underway. And I can only assume for law enforcement that finding David was a lot more personal, as David was somebody who did kill a police officer. However, only 2 days after Richard was shot by police officers, David was spotted just jogging on the side of the road. The police officer that spotted him went to question him, where David began to run through a field and into a wooded area. The police officer quickly drew his pistol and shot David. However, David did not die. Interestingly, both of these two men were found only 2 kilometers from the Canadian-US border, meaning that if they weren't found when they did, they would have likely made it into Canada and possibly escaped conviction or death altogether. Or at the very least, they would have extended their freedom by quite a bit. After everything was said and done, Richard Matt was killed. Sweat pled guilty to an additional 2 counts of felony, first-degree escape, and an additional count of promoting prison contraband, which gave him an additional 7 years, which was served consecutively with his previous life sentence. Joyce Mitchell pled guilty and received 7 years in prison and a $6,300 fine, as well as $80,000 in restitution. And as of February 2020, she was actually released and is now on parole. And Gene Palmer, the backup driver and the other prison official who aided in the escape of these 2 killers, was sentenced to 6 months in jail and fined $5,300. So yeah, if you haven't learned anything in this video so far, I think one important takeaway is that if you ever do plan on escaping prison, 2 good ways of going about it are having a helicopter or just extreme riz. And at this point, I can't even imagine the possibilities of a man with extreme riz and a helicopter. Jokes aside, let's just move on to the next and final entry on this list. And I say this list because if you guys like this concept, feel free to leave a like or a comment below letting me know you like prison escape videos. I'd be more than happy to make more of them in the future. Your support always means a lot. Let's move on. Alfred George Hines was born in 1917, and at the young age of only 7 years old, his father died when he was caught for an armed robbery and was served corporal punishment that actually ended up killing him. He was sentenced to 10 lashes from the Cat 06, which is just a crazy whip, and this entire process killed him. And because of this, Hines decided to run away from home at the age of 7. Hines briefly stayed at an orphanage before he escaped and began living on his own and surviving off of petty theft, which later landed him in a juvenile detention center, which he, at that point, once again, escaped from. Hines' upbringing was troubled to say the least, and when he turned 21, he was drafted into the Second World War. Something he didn't actually do, because he deserted the armed forces and went back to his full-time career of crime, which resulted in a jewelry heist that happened in 1953. This heist, performed by Hines, was in the multiple 6-figure range, and $90,000 of that was never found, ever. But shortly after this jewel heist, Hines was caught and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But like everybody else we've discussed on this list so far, Hines had no plans of staying in jail for his entire sentence. Only a few weeks into his stay in prison, Hines realized that at night, the guards were severely outnumbered, and there was really only 2 night guards per 1,000 inmates, which meant that Hines had a lot of time to work on his craft, and his craft in this case was metalworking. And what he was able to do was fashion a scrap piece of metal into a makeshift key to release himself from his cell without ever being detected. But picking the lock in his cell wasn't the only challenge he faced on this escape, because after he was out of his cell and out of the prison itself, he still had to climb a 20-foot wall. A feat so impressive that the media instantly gave him the name Houdini Hines because of his escape. Just keep in mind, for the guards, they were doing their nightly routine when they were walking by and they saw Hines, and then maybe an hour or 2 hours later when they would walk by again, Hines' cell was empty. There was no signs of any damage, and there was absolutely nothing changed besides the fact that Hines wasn't there. If they didn't know any better, Hines could have just disappeared into thin air. Although that obviously wasn't the case. And after his escape, Hines spent 248 days as a free man working odd jobs until he was arrested again in 1956. And it was at this point when he was sent back to prison. But Hines knew that because he was going back to prison, he was going to be made an example of, because his initial escape made national headlines. And this obviously embarrassed the prison system and the government. So now that they had him back in their claws, they weren't going to let him go. And because of this, Hines had to think fast. And what Hines decided to do was, as he was being sent to prison for the second time, he decided to sue the prison system for misconduct. And even as a criminal, he had the right to a trial. And it was at this trial where he was able to execute his second escape. While in the courtroom, he asked the judge if he could use the washroom for just a moment. The judge agreed, and two guards brought Hines directly to the washroom, where they unshackled his hands and feet and allowed him to use the facility. But as soon as Hines was unshackled, he pushed both of the guards into the bathroom and locked it with a padlock that was left in the hallway by a co-conspirator. And the only reason he was able to even lock this door at all was because the day before the trial, a co-conspirator of Hines installed screw eyes on the stall door so that he could actually apply the padlock and lock these two in the washroom. After Hines' hands and feet were free and the guards were locked in the bathroom, he instantly made a run for it, and for the next 5 hours escaped directly to the airport where he was waiting for the next flight out of England. But before he could catch any flight, he was caught and brought back to prison for a third time. Within a year of being brought back to prison for the third time, he made his third and final escape. The escape itself was nothing to write home about, although it did go to show the sheer perseverance and dedication that Hines had to not being in prison. But after being caught for a final time and brought back to jail, he decided that escaping wasn't the way to go. And from that point on, he decided to consistently get into legal disputes with the prison system to try to prove his innocence or to get his jail time appealed. He was basically spending all of his time in jail using the legal system against itself to try to get out of jail ASAP. And while he wasn't successful at it, and he did serve the rest of his time in prison, he was able to win a few £1,000s from random settlements that he was pursuing. Hines also falls into the category of orphan/foster care child turned prison escapee, which is interesting. That's definitely not something I intended to do in this video, but it is an interesting consistency I've noticed throughout most of these prison escapes. And I think the fact that Hines was able to escape prison 3 times definitely earned him the nickname Houdini Hines. But once again, we find ourselves in a situation where Hines would have been better off just serving the initial 12 years than escaping and then serving the rest of his time. Sure, he had more breaks in between, but living as an active fugitive is definitely not a life that I would want to live. I couldn't imagine having to look over your shoulder every day just to try to live a normal life. But I know I said that this was the last story in the video, but I actually have a quick bonus one, so let's get into it. Yoga is really relaxing and has a lot of health benefits. But one of the benefits that most people don't talk about when they speak of yoga is escaping prison. But for Korean thief Choi Gap-bok, being an expert in yoga for over 23 years was the deciding factor between being in jail and being a free man. Let me explain. On September 12th, 2012, Choi Gap-bok was arrested in association with a mysterious theft. It was assumed that he was the leader of a theft ring, and for that reason, the police wanted to hold him until they could gather more evidence on him in the entire situation. And on that day, Choi was placed in a cell. And while his stay was at that point undetermined, Choi was personally determined to make that stay as short as possible. And how he did so was extremely interesting, because during Choi's time in this jail cell, he realized that at the bottom of the jail cell door, there was a hole. And this hole was useful for him because every day this is how the guards would feed him. But he quickly began to ponder if this was a hole he could fit through. The hole was only 15 centimeters tall and 45 centimeters wide. Not large at all, but Choi wasn't really a large man either. Choi was only 5'4" and weighed roughly 120 pounds. Even still, this hole was put in these doors for food, not people. One night, after being fed dinner, Choi asked one of the guards if he could have some skin ointment. He felt a rash coming on and he wanted to subdue it early. And luckily, the guards obliged. They handed him a skin ointment and then went back to their post. And late into that night, Choi waited until the 3 guards that were monitoring his cell fell asleep, which is when Choi began to execute his master plan. Choi applied this skin ointment all across his body to essentially lube up and slide through the crack on the bottom of the door. After applying the ointment to his skin, specifically his upper body and head, he was able to escape his cell in only 34 seconds. And after escaping his cell, he was easily able to sneak out of the jail and be a free man. Hours after Choi had snuck out of the jail and was running as far away as he could from the jail itself, the officers woke up and they looked in his cell, and when they tried to wake up Choi, they realized that Choi was in his bed. There was a decoy in the place he should have been, but there was no evidence of an escape until they checked the CCTV footage and realized exactly how he escaped. Interestingly, Choi, who was in a cell for 5 days, had the wherewithal to put a decoy in his bed when the previous two criminals we just talked about were planning for 6 months and still couldn't drum up a decoy in any of that time. Just an interesting observation. But what else is interesting is that even though Choi was able to make nearly an impossible escape and use his flexibility and lubrication skills to escape a jail cell, he was not able to remain free for long, because 6 days after his escape, he was recaptured and put into a cell with a much smaller food slot. This one was a lot shorter, but I kind of wanted to add it as a bonus because I just thought it was funny. Some lube and yoga can get you out of a lot of tough situations. I think most people would like to believe that when you do something wrong, it'll catch up to you, whether that be legally or even just karma. But as we all know, that isn't always the case. And that's why today I'm going to be discussing serial killers who were never caught. Horrible people doing horrible things that unfortunately were never served justice. At least not yet. One quick note before we begin is that these are real criminals with real victims, and I'm going to be doing my best to be respectful as possible. This video isn't in any particular order, even though this video is a list, simply because I do not want to put any of these people above or below each other. All of these people are horrible and do not deserve a ranking. Now let's get into the video. Starting off, we have the Servant Girl Annihilator. A pretty gruesome name, but he was a pretty gruesome guy. And I felt like he was an appropriate first entry for this list because he was the first known serial killer in the United States of America. Between December 1884 and December 1885, he killed 7 women and 1 man. And he had a very peculiar signature. He killed people with an axe. In just one night, on December 24th, 1885, you're right, Christmas Eve, he murdered 3 victims with an axe, which is why they also called him the Austin Axe Murderer. For obvious reasons, there's not a lot known about this killer, and that's going to be a common trend among all of these killers, unfortunately. And a lot of what is known is the sheer brutality that happened to the victims, and for also obvious reasons, I won't be going into too much detail on that. But one interesting detail that I thought I would share is the fact that there's a rather interesting conspiracy floating around with the Servant Girl Killer, specifically being that he could potentially also be Jack the Ripper. Why? Because this string of murders in Texas happened 3 years before the murders of Jack the Ripper across the pond. Could they be the same person? Personally, I'm not sure if there's any validity to it, but it's an interesting thought. Next up, we have a rather interesting situation, as this entry isn't just one killer, it's likely many. I'm talking about the Highway of Tears killers. The Highway of Tears is a 719-kilometer long corridor of Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert in British Columbia, Canada. And this stretch of highway has become notorious for murders that have happened on it. The crimes happening on this highway date back to as early as 1970 and are still believed to be happening to this day. Due to poor economic situations and the lack of public transportation, for a lot of the poorer citizens, hitchhiking was a big method of transportation, leaving vulnerable individuals at risk. Unfortunately, in that case, that meant many Indigenous women were at risk. Almost all of the victims of the Highway of Tears were Indigenous women, and there is believed to be at least 80 missing and murdered Indigenous women. One of the saddest parts about the stretch of highway is that a lot of these victims were never even found and are still considered missing and not homicides. And focusing on the criminals, the one interesting part is that only one person has ever been convicted on this highway, and unfortunately, they were only convicted for 1 murder and could have only possibly been able to commit 2 of them, meaning that there are likely many murderers still out there not served justice. Following that, we have the Oakland County Child Killer, also known as the Babysitter Killer. And this story is seriously twisted. As the name may imply, this killer targeted children in Oakland County. Between the span of February 15th, 1976 and March 16th, 1977, only 13 months apart, 2 boys and 2 girls aged 10 to 12 went missing outside of their homes. Each child's body was discovered in a public area within 20 days of their disappearance, and all of the children were either strangled or shot. The 4 deaths triggered a murder investigation which was at the time the largest in U.S. history, and the breaking of this news also caused a significant panic among parents in Michigan. Despite a few promising leads, including the discovery of a vehicle suspected to belong to the killer, this case remains unsolved. In 2012, we had the most recent development, which investigators were able to actually create a DNA profile of the killer. But unfortunately, this didn't match up to any of the suspects or even anybody in the police database. A quick note to mention is that the 4 victims I mentioned are only confirmed victims, and there is potentially many more. And the timeline I mentioned is only the confirmed timeline, and many more could have taken place outside of that. This is just what is confirmed for this killer. Staying on the topic of murderers who targeted children, we have the alphabet murderer, also known as the alphabet killer or the double initial killer. If you haven't noticed already, a common trend is these killers having pretty obvious names, but I don't think it hurts to spell it out. This killer had an affinity for matching initials, and all 3 of their victims had the same first and last initial, with the victims having the initials CC, WW, and MM. These unsolved child murders took place between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York. I'm starting to think it was pretty rough being a child in the 1970s. All of the alphabet killer's victims were assaulted and strangled, and despite the fact that there was witnesses, specifically several motorists who saw 10-year-old Carmen Collin half naked on the side of the highway attempting to escape the killer, the police were never able to close the case. Although police did have several persons of interest, one of them connected as recently as 2011, none of them had close enough ties to the murders to be convicted. Although interestingly, one of the alphabet killer suspects was sentenced to death for murder for killing sex workers in Nevada. Completely unrelated. Strangely though, all of his victims in Nevada had the same first and last initial. Could this be the alphabet killer from New York? Seems very possible. Shifting our focus over to Scotland now, we have Bible John, an unidentified serial killer who has killed at least 3 young women between 1968 and 1969. All of Bible John's victims are believed to have met him in the Barrowland Ballroom, a popular dance hall in Glasgow, Scotland. Most of the few details known about this case come from one of the victim's sisters, who shared a taxi with her sister and the alleged killer, Bible John. The victim's sister's information helped the investigators form a psychological profile of the killer, with one of his biggest quirks being that he frequently referenced the Bible, hence his nickname, Bible John. Unfortunately, in 2010, the victim's sister has passed away, and we have lost the only eyewitness, meaning that the chances of this case ever being solved are unlikely. Returning back to the United States of America, we have a killer with probably the most outrageous name. I'm talking about the West Mesa Bone Collector. The United States media really does a good job of giving serial killers names that are way cooler than they deserve. And also just more gruesome. Like, who thought of Servant Girl Annihilator? Like, annihilation, that is an insane adjective to use. Back to the topic at hand, the West Mesa Bone Collector was a serial killer in West Mesa, Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is also one of the most recent entries on the list, as the remains of 11 women were found buried in 2009 in the desert of West Mesa, obviously. There are at least 13 other potential victims of the West Mesa Bone Collector, reported as late as 2006, who were just not buried in this one mass grave. So, confirmed 11, but potentially all the way up to 24 and beyond. Like many on this list, the police considered several suspects, but lacked enough evidence to make a strong enough case against any one suspect. Some theories suggest that the West Mesa Bone Collector may actually be a group of people involved in running a sex trafficking ring, specifically because a lot of these victims were sex workers. As recent as 2021, the police have confirmed that the case is still active, and despite the fact that the police are still receiving 20 to 30 tips per year, there is no new evidence moving the case along. Truly unfortunate. If you haven't heard about any of the killers I've mentioned in this video so far, that's about to change, because the next 2 killers I'm going to discuss are arguably some of the most well-known serial killers of all time, and that starts with the Zodiac Killer. If that name rings a bell, you probably watched the 2007 Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr. blockbuster movie, Zodiac. That movie has no doubt made the Zodiac Killer the most infamous unsolved serial killer in all of American history. The Zodiac Killer has confirmed to have killed 5 victims and injured 2 victims across the span of 1968 and 1969. But he claims that he has killed up to 37. Now you might be asking yourself, what do you mean claim? He wasn't caught. How did he talk to the police? Well, that's kind of where he got his name from. The Zodiac coined his name in a series of taunting messages that he mailed to regional newspapers, in which he threatened to go on killing sprees and bombings if they did not print his messages. Some of his letters included cryptographs and ciphers, in which the killer claimed that he was collecting the victims as slaves for the afterlife. This guy was twisted, and that's not even the start of it. Out of the 4 ciphers that the Zodiac made, 2 remain unsolved, and 1 was actually successfully cracked in 2020. Only 1 suspect has ever been named publicly by authorities, and due to the weirdness of this case and the sheer depth of the rabbit hole, there is a large public interest in this story. And I could honestly go on for hours about this with just publicly available information, but for the sake of this video, these are the important details. If this is interesting to you, I highly recommend you do some research on it, as the story does go deep. The last correspondence from the Zodiac Killer with any sort of publication was in 1974. The case has been marked inactive and then reactive a few times over the years, and in some places is still considered active to this very day. But unfortunately, even with all of the public interest, it is unlikely that this case will be solved. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Like I said, this video isn't in any specific order, but I did keep this one for last. One thing I will mention though is that this list isn't every single uncaught serial killer. Unfortunately, there is still a lot more that exist. I just couldn't make this video super long. But if you would like a part 2, I will gladly make it. And for the identity of our final killer, well, that's unknown. This is likely one of the most famous unknown serial killers, and also just serial killers to ever exist. I'm talking about Jack the Ripper. Even if you're not somebody who binges morbid content or watches serial killer documentaries on the weekends, you've probably heard of this name before. Jack the Ripper was an unidentified serial killer active in the slums of London, England in 1888. Jack's attacks typically involved women working as prostitutes who lived in the slums of East London. These women would have their throats cut and then have their abdominals manipulated. The removal of internal organs of at least 3 victims led to the suspicion that the killer had some surgical knowledge. The official numbers and even motives are unknown, but there are believed to be at least 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. Much like the Zodiac Killer, the Jack the Ripper lore goes much wider than the scope of this video. But one interesting point I wanted to make is that a lot of what solidified Jack the Ripper's legacy was unintentionally created by the media of the time, which is also the case for a lot more recent serial killers, for example, Jeffrey Dahmer and the like. It's a rather interesting byproduct of spreading awareness, and I thought I'd mention it. But that's it for me, at least for this video.